The stagecoach hit another rut, and Claire's head slammed against the wooden wall hard enough to make her vision blur. She'd stopped trying to brace herself hours ago. Her hands were too cold to grip anything properly, and exhaustion had settled into her bones like an infection. "How much farther?" she called through the panel, separating her from the driver. No answer. Just the howl of wind and the labored breathing of horses being pushed too hard through a storm that should have grounded them 2 days ago. Clara pressed her face against the gap in the leather curtain. Nothing but white. The world had disappeared into a wall of snow so thick she couldn't see the horses pulling the coach. For all she knew, they were driving off a cliff. She pulled back and wrapped her arms tighter around herself, though it did nothing against the cold seeping through her threadbare coat. The dress beneath it, her nicest one, saved for meeting her future husband, was soaked through from a leak in the roof she'd given up trying to avoid. Samuel Whitmore, landowner, age 42, seeking companion for ranch in Helena Valley. She'd memorized every word of his letter. 3 pages of careful handwriting describing a prosperous cattle operation, a comfortable house, and a life far from the suffocating tenement blocks of Boston. He'd sent money for passage, asked for a photograph, which she'd borrowed a decent dress to sit for. Promised she'd want for nothing. Clara wasn't naive enough to think it was a love match, but it was a future, something that belonged to her, not her aunt's family who'd worked her like a servant since her parents died when she was 14. The coach lurched violently to the left. Clara grabbed for the hanging strap and missed, sliding across the bench into a pile of luggage that had broken loose from its bindings. Something hard jabbed into her ribs, the corner of her trunk probably. She shoved it away and tried to right herself as the coach slowed, then stopped completely. "Driver?" She knocked on the panel. "What's happening?" Footsteps crunched through snow. The door jerked open and a blast of freezing air hit her like a fist. The driver, a grizzled man named Hutchins who'd barely spoken to her since they left Fort Benton, stood in the opening, ice crusted in his beard. "End of the line!" Clara stared at him. "What?" "I said end of the line. Get out." "This isn't Helena. We're not even—" "Horses are done. Storm's getting worse. There's a settlement half a mile that way." He jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "You can wait it out there." "Wait it?" Clara felt something cold and sharp twist in her chest. "You're leaving me here?" "Got no choice. Take your bags and go. I paid for passage to Helena, and I got you as far as I could without killing my animals or myself." Hutchins reached past her and grabbed her trunk, hauling it out into the snow. "Move, or I'll leave your things too." Clara scrambled out after him, her boots sinking into snow up to her knees. The wind immediately tried to knock her sideways. She grabbed the coach for balance, but Hutchins was already climbing back onto the driver's seat. "Wait, how do I— Oh!" "Follow the road. There's a marker about a quarter mile. Turn north. You'll see lights." He snapped the reins before she could respond. The horses lurched forward, and within seconds the coach had vanished into the white. Clara stood alone in the storm, staring at the empty space where her transportation had been. Her future husband was expecting her in Helena. She was supposed to arrive tomorrow, clean and presentable and ready to begin her new life. Instead, she was stranded in the middle of nowhere with a trunk she couldn't carry and clothes that wouldn't keep her alive through the night. "Move," something in her head whispered. "You freeze if you stand here." She grabbed the trunk's handle and pulled. It barely budged. The snow was too deep, and the trunk too heavy with everything she owned. She tried dragging it a few feet, fell, got up, tried again. Her hands were already numb inside her gloves. She couldn't take it. Not through this. Clara opened the trunk with shaking fingers and started pulling things out. 2 dresses. Leave them. Books. Leave them. The photograph of her parents. She shoved that inside her coat. Her sewing kit. Keep it. The money Samuel had sent, sewn into the lining of her spare bodice, she tore it out and stuffed it into her pocket along with the letter proving who she was and where she was supposed to be. The wind screamed. Snow piled onto her shoulders faster than she could brush it off. She forced herself to close the trunk on everything else, stood up, and started walking. The marker Hutchins mentioned turned out to be a rotted signpost with writing too faded to read. Clara took the turn anyway because going straight meant walking into empty wilderness, and at least this path showed ruts from wagon wheels. Someone used this route. That meant people, shelter, fire. She lost feeling in her feet after the first 10 minutes. After 20, she couldn't tell if she was still on the road or wandering into the forest. The world was just white and cold, and the burning in her lungs every time she breathed. When the first building materialized out of the snow, she thought she was hallucinating. It was a cabin, no, a store of some kind based on the porch, and the faded sign she couldn't read. Light glowed in the windows. Clara stumbled toward it like a moth, fell up the steps, and half crawled to the door. She pounded on it with fists she could barely feel. Nothing. She pounded again, harder. The door jerked open so suddenly she almost fell inside. A man stood there, big, bearded, holding a shotgun pointed at her chest. "We're closed," he said. Clara stared up at him, snow-blind and shaking so hard she could barely stand. "Please, I said closed." He started to shut the door. She jammed her boot into the gap. "I'll freeze." "Not my problem. I have money." The words came out desperate, cracked. She hated how she sounded but didn't care enough to stop. "I can pay for a room. Anything. Please." The man studied her for a long moment. Behind him, Claire could see a store interior, shelves, a stove burning in the corner, blessed warmth radiating from it. Her whole body leaned toward it involuntarily. "How much money?" he finally asked. "Enough." She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out a few bills, holding them up with fingers that wouldn't straighten properly. "I just need somewhere warm until the storm passes." He looked at the money, then at her face. Whatever he saw there made him step back. "Inside, quick, before you let all the heat out." Clara stumbled over the threshold. The door slammed behind her, cutting off the wind's howl. The sudden silence was almost as disorienting as the warmth. "Name's Garrett," the man said, setting his shotgun against the wall. "This is my trading post. You got business in Bloodstone, or you just lost?" "Bloodstone?" Clara tried to remember her maps. The name meant nothing. "Is that where we are?" "For better or worse." Garrett moved to the stove and picked up a kettle. "Where were you headed?" "Helena, I'm supposed to—" She stopped, swaying on her feet. The warmth was making her dizzy. "Sit down before you fall down." Garrett pulled out a chair. "Helena's 60 miles southeast of here. Whatever fool was driving that coach dumped you way off course." 60 miles. Clara sank into the chair and watched numbly as he poured something hot into a tin cup. Tea, maybe, or coffee so weak it looked like tea. He shoved it into her hands. "Drink." She did. It tasted like dirt but was hot, and that was all that mattered. She wrapped both hands around the cup and let the heat seep into her frozen fingers. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me yet. You picked a hell of a time to get stranded in Bloodstone." Garrett leaned against the counter, studying her with the same wary look he'd given her at the door. "Storm like this could last a week. And even when it clears, there's no guarantee another coach will come through. We've been cut off since December." "December?" Clara looked up. "It's February." "I know what month it is." "Then why, Isham?" "Because the mining company blew the South Bridge trying to keep their competitors out, and the territorial government hasn't bothered fixing it yet." He crossed his arms. "You want to get to Helena, you're either walking through the mountains or waiting until spring. Maybe longer if the road crew decides we're not worth the trouble." Clara stared at him. The cup trembled in her hands, sloshing hot liquid onto her fingers. She barely felt it. "I can't wait until spring." "Then you better start walking." Garrett's expression didn't change. "Though you won't make it 2 miles in this storm, so I'd suggest the waiting option if you like being alive." "You don't understand. I'm expected in Helena. Tomorrow. I have—" She fumbled for Samuel's letter, pulled it out. The paper was damp and crumpled, but the ink hadn't run. "I'm supposed to marry a man who's never met me, and if I don't show up, I have nothing. No job, no home, no—" "Let me see that." Garrett took the letter before she could finish. He read it quickly, eyebrows rising. "Samuel Whitmore. You're marrying Sam Whitmore? You know him?" "Everyone knows Sam. He's rich as sin and about as warm as a fence post." Garrett handed the letter back. "Well, he'll have to wait. Nothing's moving through these mountains until the weather breaks." Clara wanted to argue, but her brain felt sluggish from cold and exhaustion. She took another sip of the terrible coffee instead. The door to the back room opened and a woman emerged, small, dark-haired, wearing an expression that suggested Clara was the last thing she wanted to see. "Who's this?" the woman asked. "Found her half frozen on the porch," Garrett said. "Says she's got money." "How much?" Clara bristled at the tone. Enough to pay for a room. The woman, Garrett's wife, Clara assumed, looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. We don't run a hotel. I'm not asking for luxury, just somewhere I won't die. Clara met her eyes. She'd dealt with hostile landlords and employers her entire life. She knew how this worked. I can pay $3 a week. 3? The woman laughed, sharp and incredulous. Girl, you have any idea what things cost out here? More than Boston, I'm guessing. Clara kept her voice steady despite the anger rising in her chest. But I'm also guessing you don't get many customers this time of year, and $3 for letting me sleep in your storage room is better than nothing. Garrett and his wife exchanged a look. Some unspoken conversation happened between them, ending with the woman's shoulders dropping in resignation. $5, she said, per week. You get a corner of the storage room, 1 meal a day, and access to the stove. No cooking your own food, no bringing men around, no causing trouble. We catch you stealing, you're out in the snow. Understood? It was highway robbery, and they all knew it, but Clara also knew she had no leverage here. Understood, she said quietly. Good. I'm Margaret. Pay up front. Margaret held out her hand. Clara counted out $5 from her carefully hoarded funds and watched them disappear into Margaret's apron. That left her with $18 to her name, nowhere near enough to survive until spring. I'll figure something out, she told herself. I always do. Margaret led her to the storage room, a cramped space barely big enough for the crates and barrels stacked along the walls. She pointed to a spot near the back. There. Don't touch anything that's not yours, and stay out of the way during business hours. She paused at the door. There's a privy out back. You go at night, take a lantern, and make noise. Wolves have been coming down from the mountains. Then she was gone, leaving Clara alone in the dark. Clara stood in the silence for a moment, listening to the wind hammer against the walls. Then she sat down on the floor in her designated corner, pulled her knees to her chest, and let herself shake. The next 3 days passed in a blur of cold, hunger, and growing dread. The storm didn't break. If anything, it got worse. Snow piled against the trading post's walls until the windows on the north side were completely buried. The temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the glass, and Clara's breath came out in visible clouds even near the stove. Garrett's 1 meal a day turned out to be a bowl of thin soup and a piece of bread so hard she had to dip it in the liquid to make it edible. Margaret made it clear this was charity, not hospitality, and Clara should be grateful for even that much. She tried making herself useful, sweeping floors, organizing shelves, anything to justify her presence. Margaret tolerated it, but never thanked her. Garrett mostly ignored her except to grunt when she asked questions about the town. Other customers came and went. Rough-looking men who tracked snow across the floor and paid for supplies with silver coins or gold dust. They stared at Clara with open curiosity and sometimes something darker that made her keep her distance. On the 4th day, the wind finally died. Clara woke to silence. Not the peaceful kind, the wary, waiting kind that meant the storm had paused to catch its breath. She got up and looked through the front window. The town, if you could call it that, revealed itself in the gray morning light. Bloodstone Valley was a collection of maybe 30 buildings scattered along both sides of a frozen creek. Most were rough log structures that looked like they'd been thrown together in a hurry. A few were more substantial, a hotel, a saloon, what might have been a bank. At the far end, Clara could see the dark mouths of mine entrances cut into the mountainside. Everything was buried under several feet of snow. No smoke rose from most of the chimneys. The streets were empty except for a single figure trudging through drifts toward the trading post. "We're open," Garrett called from behind her. "Get out front if you're planning to keep eating." Clara moved to the side as he unlocked the door. The figure from outside turned out to be a young man, maybe 20, with a face pinched from cold and eyes that darted around nervously. "Mr. Garrett," he said, "my mother needs medicine. The cough syrup, if you have any left." "I have some." Garrett pulled a bottle from behind the counter. "That'll be $2. "2?" The young man's face fell. "Last month it was 50 cents. Last month I had a full stock. Now I got 3 bottles left and no idea when the next shipment's coming." Garrett set the bottle down but didn't push it across the counter. "Supply and demand, son. You want it or not?" The young man fumbled in his pockets and pulled out a handful of coins. He counted them twice, his hands shaking. I only have $1.30. Then I guess your mother stays sick. Clara watched the young man's face crumble. He looked at the medicine bottle like it was the only thing standing between his mother and a grave. Please, he said quietly. She can't breathe right. The cough is getting worse. I can bring you the rest tomorrow, I swear. I don't do credit. Garrett crossed his arms. Not anymore. Too many people in this town already owe me money they'll never pay back. I'll pay. I promise I'll. No credit means no credit. You got $1.30. You can have. Garrett looked at his shelves. A pound of flour and some salt. That's it. The young man stood there for a long moment, coins clutched in his fist. Then he turned and walked out without buying anything. Clara stared after him, anger building in her chest. That was cruel. That was business. Garrett didn't look at her. I'm not running a charity here. He's going to watch his mother die because you won't give him 70 cents of credit. And I'm going to watch my family starve if I keep giving away supplies I can't replace. Garrett met her eyes finally. You think I like this? Half the town's broke. The mine's barely producing. And the company that owns everything is squeezing us harder every week. I give that kid medicine on credit. Tomorrow there'll be 10 more people expecting the same. Then what? Clara wanted to argue, but the words stuck in her throat. She understood his logic even if she hated it. In Boston, she'd watched shopkeepers make the same calculations. Kindness was a luxury poor people couldn't afford. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. She spent the rest of the morning in the storage room listening to similar transactions play out. People came in desperate and left empty-handed or with far less than they needed. Prices had tripled since December, Garrett explained to each customer. Supplies were running out. The bridge was destroyed. No one was coming to help. By afternoon, Clara had heard enough. She found Margaret in the back room mending a shirt. I need work. Margaret didn't look up. Doing what? Anything. I can sew, clean, cook. We don't need help. Then I need to know who does. Clara kept her voice steady. My money's running out. I can't pay $5 a week for more than 2 more weeks, and you said yourself the roads might not clear until spring. So either you help me find work, or you're going to have a dead boarder in your storage room come March. That got Margaret's attention. She set down the shirt and studied Clara with shrewd eyes. You really a mail-order bride? I was supposed to be. Supposed to be. Margaret snorted. Girl, you got dumped in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. Even if the road's clear tomorrow, there's no guarantee Sam Whitmore will still want you. You're damaged goods now. The words hit harder than Clara expected. She'd been trying not to think about that possibility. Maybe, she said carefully, but I still need to eat until I find out. Margaret considered this. You any good with numbers? Better than most. There's a woman up the valley runs a boarding house. She's been looking for help with her books since her husband died. Can't pay much, but it's something. She paused. Fair warning, the walk up there is dangerous. You'd be crossing mining company territory, and they don't like strangers asking questions. I'll risk it. Your funeral. Margaret pulled out a scrap of paper and drew a crude map. Follow the creek north about 2 miles. Big house on the left. Can't miss it. Name's Ruth Calloway. Tell her I sent you. And take this. She handed Clara a small knife in a leather sheath. Keep it hidden, but keep it close. Clara took the knife, surprised by the gesture. Thank you. Don't thank me. You'll probably end up regretting this whole mess. But Margaret's expression had softened slightly. And girl? When you talk to Ruth, don't mention you're trying to marry Sam Whitmore. There's history there, and none of it's good. Book. The walk to Ruth Calloway's boarding house took Clara through parts of Bloodstone Valley she hadn't seen yet. The creek ran between high banks carved out by years of spring flooding. On either side, the land rose toward mountains that seemed to go up forever. Mine entrances dotted the slopes like dark eyes watching her pass. Most looked abandoned, timbers rotting, equipment rusting in the snow. But a few were clearly active. Clara heard the distant sound of hammering, saw smoke rising from warming shacks. Once, she passed a group of men hauling ore carts along rails that disappeared into the mountain. They stopped and stared at her, but no one spoke. She walked faster. The boarding house turned out to be a 2-story structure that had seen better days. Paint peeled from the siding, and one of the porch posts leaned at an angle that suggested the whole thing might collapse in the next strong wind. But smoke rose from the chimney, and curtains hung in the windows, signs of life that felt almost welcoming. Clara knocked. The woman who answered was older than Margaret, maybe 50, with gray streaking her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of either laughter or hardship. Based on her surroundings, Clara guessed hardship. "Help you?" the woman asked. "Mrs. Calloway, Margaret Garrett sent me. She said you might need help with bookkeeping." Ruth Calloway's eyebrows rose. "She did she?" She looked Clara up and down. "You any good with numbers, or is Margaret just trying to pawn off another mouth I can't afford to feed?" "I managed household accounts for my aunt's family in Boston for 9 years," Clara said. 3 businesses, 2 rental properties, and a staff of 4. I can read, write, do arithmetic faster than most men, and I don't steal. Margaret can vouch for that much, at least. Ruth stepped back. "Come in, then. Let's see what you can do." The interior of the boarding house was cleaner than Clara expected, but shabby. Mismatched furniture, threadbare rugs, walls that needed painting. A few people sat in the common room, an elderly couple, a young woman with a baby, a man with one leg missing below the knee. They all looked up when Clara entered, then went back to their business. Ruth led her to a small office off the main hall. Papers covered every surface, ledgers, receipts, handwritten notes, everything in complete disarray. "My husband used to handle this," Ruth said. "He died in November. Heart gave out while he was chopping wood. Since then, I've been trying to keep track of who owes what and who's paid, but..." She gestured helplessly at the mess. "I'm a terrible bookkeeper. Can you make sense of it?" Clara picked up the nearest ledger and flipped through it. The handwriting was barely legible, entries were out of order, and several pages had water damage that made them almost impossible to read. But she'd seen worse. Her aunt's records had been a disaster until Clara took them over. "I can fix this," she said. "It'll take time, but I can do it." "How much time?" Clara studied the piles. "A week, maybe 2, to get everything organized and figure out where you actually stand financially. After that, a few hours a week to maintain it." "And what do you want in return?" "Room and board, plus a small wage if you can afford it. If you can't, just the room and board." Clara met her eyes. "I'm stranded here until the road's clear. I need somewhere safe to stay, and I'm willing to work for it." Ruth considered this. "You in some kind of trouble?" "No, just unlucky." Clara hesitated, then decided honesty might work better than evasion. "I was supposed to marry a man in Helena. The stagecoach driver dumped me here instead, and now I'm stuck until spring." "Who were you supposed to marry?" Clara remembered Margaret's warning too late. "Samuel Whitmore." Something dark flickered across Ruth's face. "Sam Whitmore." "You know him?" "Everyone knows Sam." Ruth's voice had gone flat. "Rich, respected, always gets what he wants. Yeah, I know him." Margaret said there was history. "There is." Ruth stared at the papers on her desk. "He owned this boarding house once, sold it to my husband for twice what it was worth, then made sure the bank gave us terrible loan terms. When we couldn't keep up with payments, he tried to take it back. Only reason we kept it is because my husband knew where Sam buried some bodies, figuratively speaking." "Oh." Clara felt her stomach sink. "I didn't know." "Why would you? You're from Boston. You probably think he's a gentleman because he writes pretty letters." Ruth looked at her. "Let me guess. He told you about his ranch, his success, how he needed a refined woman to help him build something proper out here?" "Something like that." "He tell you what happened to his first wife?" Clara's mouth went dry. "He's been married before?" "Twice. First one died in childbirth. Second one ran off with a surveyor after 6 months. Word is Sam made her life so miserable she'd rather risk the wilderness than spend another day under his roof." Ruth crossed her arms. "You still planning to marry him if you get to Helena?" Clara realized she didn't have an answer. "I don't know." "Well, you got time to figure it out." Ruth's expression softened slightly. "And in the meantime, you can work for me. Room upstairs shared with 2 other girls. Breakfast and dinner included. No wage until I see if you're as good as you claim. Fair?" It was more than fair. It was salvation. "Fair," Clara agreed. "Good. You can start tomorrow." Ruth headed for the door, then paused. "And girl?" "Out here. Being unlucky and being in trouble often look the same. Watch yourself. This valley's got teeth. Clara's first week at the boarding house passed in a blur of numbers, names, and slowly unraveling chaos. Ruth's finances were worse than the ledgers suggested. The boarding house was losing money every month, debts were piling up, and at least 3 tenants hadn't paid rent since December. When Clara pointed this out, Ruth just shrugged. "I can't get blood from a stone," she said. "Those folks don't have money because the mine's barely operating. I throw them out. They freeze to death." That sit right with you? It didn't. But it also didn't solve Ruth's problem. Clara spent long hours reconstructing the accounts, reaching out to debtors, negotiating payment plans. She discovered that Ruth was being overcharged for nearly everything: flour, coal, basic supplies. When she mentioned it, Ruth laughed bitterly. "Welcome to Bloodstone. The mining company owns the suppliers, and they charge whatever they want. You complain, your next shipment gets delayed until you apologize. That's illegal. Prove it to a judge 3 mountain ranges away who's probably taking bribes from the same company." Ruth shook her head. "Girl, you're thinking like this is civilization. It's not. Out here, the law is whoever has the most guns and the least conscience." Clara had heard similar things in Boston. Different context, same principle. Power protected itself. But hearing it didn't mean accepting it. She started making notes. Who charged what? Which suppliers had monopolies? How much things cost in Fort Benton versus Bloodstone? The patterns of price gouging became obvious when she laid them out properly. "What are you doing?" Ruth asked one evening, finding Clara surrounded by papers. "Building a case." Clara didn't look up. If someone could prove the mining company is systematically overcharging for basic supplies, that's theft on a massive scale. Even corrupt judges have to respond to that level of evidence. And who's going to present this case? You? Why not? Ruth stared at her. Then she started laughing, not mockingly, but with genuine surprise. "You've been here a week, and you're already trying to fight the Blackthorn Mining Company. Girl, you got ambition or a death wish?" "Neither. I just don't like being cheated." Clara met her eyes. "And neither should anyone else." "Well, good luck with that. Meanwhile, we still need to pay for coal before everyone freezes." She was right, of course. Clara set aside her notes and went back to the immediate crisis of keeping the boarding house running through the winter. But she didn't forget about the price gouging, or the desperate families, or the mining company that seemed to have its boot on everyone's neck. Clara met Cole Mercer on her 10th day in Bloodstone Valley. She was walking back from the trading post. Margaret had asked her to pick up a package, when she heard shouting from the saloon. Nothing unusual. Men got drunk and loud every night. But this sounded different, angrier. Then someone crashed through the saloon door and landed in the snow. Clara stopped, uncertain whether to help or run. The man who'd been thrown out was young, barely more than a boy, with blood running from his nose. 2 larger men followed him outside, miners, based on their clothes, and the coal dust still visible on their faces. "Stay down," one of them growled. "Next time you accuse me of cheating, I'll break more than your nose." The boy struggled to his feet. "You were dealing from the bottom. Everyone saw it. Everyone saw you losing and making excuses." The miner grabbed the boy's collar. "Maybe we need to teach you some manners." "Let him go." The voice came from behind Clara. She turned and saw a man on horseback, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and a hat pulled low against the cold. His face was hard to make out in the fading light, but something about the way he sat in the saddle spoke of someone comfortable with violence. The miners turned, one of them groaned. "Mercer, this isn't your business. You're beating a kid in the street. That's everyone's business." The rider, Mercer, didn't raise his voice, but something in it made the miners step back. "Let him go and walk away." "Or what?" Mercer didn't answer. He just looked at them, one hand resting on something at his hip that Clara couldn't quite see. The miners exchanged glances. Then the one holding the boy shoved him toward Mercer and retreated into the saloon. "Get home, Ethan," Mercer said to the boy, "and stay out of card games you can't afford to lose." The boy muttered something that might have been thanks and stumbled off into the growing dark. Mercer turned his horse and only then seemed to notice Clara standing there. "You lost?" he asked. "No, just—" She gestured vaguely at where the fight had been. Startled, he studied her for a moment. Even in the dim light, Clara could see his eyes were cold. Not cruel exactly, but empty in a way that suggested he'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. "You're the girl from Boston," he said finally. "The one staying at Ruth's place." Word traveled fast in small towns. "That's right. Long way from home." "I didn't have much choice in the matter." Clara straightened, unwilling to be intimidated despite the fact that he was on horseback and probably armed. "Thank you for helping that boy." "Wasn't helping him, just didn't want to watch him get killed." Mercer gathered his reins. "Stay off the streets after dark. Things are getting worse." "Worse than miners beating people?" "Much worse." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that might have been polite if his expression had matched it, and rode off. Clara watched him disappear into the snow, unsettled by the encounter. That night, she asked Ruth about him. "Cole Mercer?" Ruth was mending another shirt, her needle moving with practiced efficiency. "He's a rancher up in the high country. Keeps to himself mostly." "He seemed—" Clara searched for the right word. "Hard. That's one way to put it." Ruth bit off a thread. "He lost his wife and daughter 5 years back. Raiders hit his ranch during a winter storm, killed them both before Cole could get back from town. He tracked down every man involved and delivered them to the territorial marshal. Well, most of them. Rumor says a couple never made it to trial." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "He killed them?" "Nobody knows for sure, but Cole hasn't been the same since. He rebuilt his ranch, but he won't take on ranch hands or let anyone get close. Just him and his cattle up there, alone." Ruth set aside the shirt. "Why do you ask?" "He stopped a fight outside the saloon tonight, then warned me things were getting worse." "What did he mean?" Ruth's face darkened. "The mining company's been pushing harder lately, trying to buy up land, force people out. They want total control of the valley, and they're not being gentle about it. A few families have already left. Others have had mysterious accidents, barns burning down, livestock disappearing." "Why doesn't someone stop them?" "Who?" "The sheriff works for Blackthorn Mining. The territorial government is 3 weeks away by good roads, and we haven't had good roads in months. We're on our own out here." Ruth stood and stretched. "That's what Cole meant. Things are going to get worse before they get better, if they get better at all." Clara went to bed that night thinking about violence wrapped in business deals, about families driven from their homes by men in suits, about a lonely rancher with ghosts in his eyes. She also thought about Samuel Whitmore and whether she really wanted to marry a man who'd contributed to the same kind of suffering. The answer was becoming clearer every day. 2 weeks after Clara's arrival, the first ranch burned. She woke to shouting in the pre-dawn darkness and stumbled downstairs to find Ruth standing at the window, staring at an orange glow on the eastern ridge. "That's the Morrison place," Ruth said quietly. "Family of 6. They refused to sell to Blackthorn last month." Clara pressed her face to the cold glass. Even from miles away, she could see flames climbing into the black sky. Shouldn't someone help them? By the time anyone gets up there, it'll be ash. Ruth turned away from the window. "Get dressed. We'll have refugees by breakfast." She was right. The Morrisons arrived an hour later, a couple in their 40s, 3 children, and an elderly grandmother who couldn't stop coughing from smoke inhalation. Everything they owned had been in that house. Now they stood in Ruth's parlor wearing nightclothes and blankets, watching their youngest child cry into her mother's shoulder. Clara helped Ruth settle them into spare rooms, brought hot water for washing, found clean clothes that more or less fit. The whole time, nobody spoke about what had happened. The silence felt heavier than any conversation. It wasn't until the children were asleep and the adults gathered around Ruth's kitchen table that Mr. Morrison finally broke. "They came after midnight," he said, staring at his hands. 3 men on horses. They didn't even try to hide their faces. Just rode up, threw torches through the windows, and waited outside to make sure we got out alive." "Did they say anything?" Ruth asked. "One of them did. Said this was our last warning. Next time we wouldn't be so lucky." Morrison looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "We weren't even fighting them anymore. I told Hale's man last week we'd think about selling. That wasn't good enough. They wanted us gone now." His wife reached for his hand. "We're alive. That's what matters." "We're broke." Morrison pulled away from her. "Everything we had was in that house. 5 years of work, gone in 20 minutes. Clara wanted to say something comforting, but couldn't find words that didn't sound empty. so she just refilled their coffee cups and stayed quiet. The next morning, she walked into town looking for answers and found chaos instead. A crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Men mostly, but a few women too, all shouting at once. Clara pushed close enough to hear a thin man in a suit trying to calm them down. "Understand your concerns, but without evidence." "Evidence?" A rancher Clara recognized from the trading post stepped forward. "The Morrison place is still smoking. You want evidence? Right up there and look." "I have looked, Mr. Patterson, and what I saw was a chimney fire that spread out of control. Tragic, but accidents happen." "Accident." Patterson spat the word. "You know damn well it wasn't an accident." The suited man, Sheriff Dalton, Clara realized, straightened his shoulders. "I know the Morrisons let their chimney go all winter without proper cleaning. I know they were burning green wood because they couldn't afford seasoned, and I know that's a recipe for exactly what happened last night." "You're lying. I'm stating facts." Dalton's voice hardened. "And unless someone has actual proof of arson, this conversation is over. Now clear out before I start arresting people for disturbing the peace." The crowd erupted again, angrier this time. Clara saw hands reaching for weapons, knives mostly, though one man had a pistol tucked in his belt. This was about to turn ugly. Then someone shouted, "Mercer's here!" The crowd parted as Cole Mercer rode through on a gray horse that looked like it could kick a man's head clean off. He dismounted in one smooth motion and tied the reins to the hitching post before turning to face the sheriff. "Cole," Dalton said carefully, "this doesn't concern you. The Morrison family is sleeping in Ruth Calloway's boarding house because someone burned their home down. That concerns everyone in this valley." Cole's voice was calm, but Clara heard the threat underneath it. "You planning to investigate or just keep lying to these people?" "I don't lie." "Then you're stupid, and I don't think you're stupid." Cole moved closer to the porch. "We both know what happened. Question is whether you're going to do your job or keep taking Blackthorn's money." Dalton's face flushed. "You better watch your mouth." "Or what? You'll arrest me?" Cole smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. "Go ahead and try. See how that works out." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension stretched so tight, Clara thought it might snap and take someone's life with it. Then Dalton backed down. "I'll look into it," he muttered. "But I'm not making promises." "You do that." Cole turned to the crowd. "Anyone else get threatened recently? Anyone have property damaged or livestock go missing?" Hands went up. More than Clara expected. "Write it down," Cole said. "Names, dates, what happened. Bring it to Ruth's place tonight. We're going to document everything and send it to the territorial governor." "That'll take weeks," someone called out. "Maybe months. What are we supposed to do until then?" "Protect yourselves. Watch each other's property. Don't go anywhere alone after dark." Cole scanned the crowd. "And if Blackthorn's men come around making threats, you make sure there are witnesses. They want to operate in the dark. We shine light on everything they do." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was more than anyone else had offered. The crowd started to disperse, men talking in low voices about forming patrols and checking on neighbors. Clara hung back, watching Cole untie his horse. He noticed her staring and raised an eyebrow. "Something you want to say?" "That was brave," Clara said. "Standing up to the sheriff like that?" "Wasn't brave, was necessary." He swung back into the saddle. "You're Ruth's bookkeeper, right?" "How did you—" "Small town. Everyone knows everyone's business." Cole gathered his reins. "You any good with organizing information?" "I've been told I am." "Then help coordinate what people bring tonight. We need it clear enough that even a corrupt governor can't ignore it." He started to ride off, then paused. "And Miss Bennett? Stay away from Blackthorn's men. They don't like questions, and they especially don't like women asking them." He left before Clara could respond. That evening, Ruth's parlor filled with people carrying stories of intimidation, theft, and violence. Clara sat at a table with paper and ink, writing as fast as she could while Ruth directed traffic and kept coffee flowing. The accounts painted a picture far worse than Clara had imagined. Blackthorn Mining Company hadn't just been pushing people out. They'd been systematically destroying anyone who refused to cooperate. Burned barns, poisoned wells, dead livestock. And through it all, Sheriff Dalton had done nothing except blame the victims. "This is organized crime," Clara said after the last person left, and she sat staring at pages of testimony. "This isn't just business competition. This is—" Theft, extortion, and conspiracy. Cole's voice came from the doorway. Clara hadn't heard him come in. Welcome to the frontier, Miss Bennett, where the law is whatever the richest man says it is. Ruth poured him coffee without asking. You think the governor will care? Probably not. But if we document everything and enough people sign it, he'll at least have to pretend to investigate. Cole took the cup and sat down heavily in one of Ruth's worn chairs. More importantly, it establishes a record. If things get worse, when things get worse, we'll have proof we tried the legal route first. Before what? Clara asked. Cole met her eyes. Before people start shooting back. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ruth crossed her arms, face troubled but not surprised. Clara realized she was the only one shocked by the suggestion. It won't come to that, she said, though she didn't sound convinced even to herself. Maybe not. Cole drank his coffee in one long swallow. But you should prepare yourself for the possibility. Men like Victor Hale don't stop because you ask nicely. They stop when stopping costs them more than continuing. You're talking about war. I'm talking about survival. He stood and handed the cup back to Ruth. Thanks for the coffee. I'll write out tomorrow and get more signatures from the northern families. With luck, we'll have enough to make a case by the end of the week. After he left, Clara organized the testimony into categories: property destruction, theft, assault, witness intimidation. The patterns were impossible to miss once laid out properly. Blackthorn wasn't just targeting individuals, they were systematically clearing the valley of anyone who might resist their control. We need to get this to the governor fast, she said. Ruth looked skeptical. How? The roads are still blocked, and even if they weren't, you think Blackthorn's going to let a messenger ride out of here carrying evidence against them? She had a point. Clara stared at the papers, frustration building in her chest. All this documentation meant nothing if they couldn't deliver it. There has to be a way, she muttered. Maybe there is. Ruth pulled out a battered map and spread it on the table. There's a northern route through the mountains. Dangerous as hell, especially in winter, but it connects to a different territorial road. If someone made it through, they could reach Fort Benson in maybe 10 days. Who would be crazy enough to try that in February? Cole might. He knows those mountains better than anyone. Ruth traced the route with one finger. Of course, he'd need a damn good reason to risk his neck for people he barely knows. Clara thought about the way Cole had confronted the sheriff, the way he'd organized the meeting tonight, the careful way he'd avoided looking at the Morrison children while their parents talked about losing everything. I think he already has a reason, she said quietly. Over the next 5 days, Clara threw herself into documenting Blackthorn's crimes with an intensity that surprised even her. She interviewed families, cross-referenced dates, built timelines showing the pattern of attacks. Ruth's dining room became a makeshift office, papers organized into careful stacks that grew larger each day. Cole came and went, bringing more testimony from outlying ranches. He rarely stayed long, but Clara noticed he always checked her work before leaving, his scarred hands careful with the pages. You're thorough, he said one afternoon, reading through her summary of witness accounts. I learned from my aunt. She taught me that if you're going to accuse someone powerful, you better have perfect records. Clara added another name to her list. Otherwise, they'll find the one mistake and use it to discredit everything else. Smart woman. Not really. She mostly used her skills to cheat people out of their wages. Clara set down her pen. But the principle still applies. Cole actually smiled at that. A brief flash of something almost human before his usual guardedness returned. You don't talk like most mail-order brides I've met. How many have you met? Fair point. He set down the papers. Ruth says you're organizing all this to present to the territorial governor. That's the plan. It's a good plan. Might even work, if we can get it to him. Cole paused. I'm riding north in 3 days. Going to try that mountain route Ruth mentioned. Figure I can make Fort Benson in 2 weeks if the weather holds. Clara looked up sharply. That's suicide in winter. Probably. But sitting here waiting for Blackthorn to burn us out one family at a time is definitely suicide. At least this way we're doing something. He met her eyes. I'll need that documentation finished before I leave. Can you do it? Yes. The word came out before Clara fully processed what she was agreeing to. But you can't go alone. If something happens to you, then the documents don't get delivered and we're no worse off than we are now. Cole pulled his coat tighter. I've made harder rides. Not in February through unmapped wilderness. Who says it's unmapped? I used to scout for the cavalry. I know those mountains. He headed for the door. 3 days, Miss Bennett. Make them count. After he left, Ruth came over and looked at the papers scattered across the table. You're really going to help him with this? You think I shouldn't? I think Cole Mercer is a decent man carrying around more grief than anyone should have to bear. And I think riding into those mountains in winter is exactly the kind of thing a man does when he's not entirely sure he wants to come back. Ruth's voice was gentle but firm. Just make sure you understand what you're helping him do. Clara thought about that while she worked late into the night, organizing testimony and drafting a formal complaint to the territorial governor. She thought about Cole's empty eyes and the careful way he kept everyone at a distance, about a man who'd lost everything and was now risking what little he had left to help people he barely knew. She also thought about her own situation, about Samuel Whitmore waiting in Helena for a bride who was increasingly certain she didn't want to marry him, about the life she'd planned versus the one she was living now. Somewhere between Boston and Bloodstone Valley, Clara had stopped being the person who took the safe choice. She wasn't sure when it happened, but she couldn't deny it anymore. The next 2 days blurred together. Clara barely slept, surviving on coffee and determination while she compiled evidence and drafted the formal documentation. Ruth helped when she could, but the boarding house still needed running, and there were only so many hours in a day. On the third day, Clara finished just after dawn. She sat back and looked at the neat stack of papers. 50 pages of testimony, timelines, witness statements, and a carefully argued legal brief that would have impressed her aunt's lawyers. It was the best work she'd ever done. It might also get Cole killed. She was still staring at the documents when he arrived, riding up just as the sun broke over the eastern mountains. He looked grimmer than usual, which Clara hadn't thought possible. It's done, she said, handing him the stack. Cole flipped through it carefully, his expression unreadable. This is thorough. I know. Governor might actually read it. I hope so. Clara wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. You should take duplicates, in case something happens to the originals. I already thought of that. He produced a waterproof leather case from his saddlebag. I'll keep the main copy on me and stash duplicates along the route. That way, if I don't make it, someone else might find them. The casual way he talked about not making it sent a chill through Clara that had nothing to do with the temperature. When do you leave? She asked. Now. Weather's clearing, and I want to make the high pass before the next storm hits. Cole secured the documents in the case. Ruth's got a letter you can send to your Mr. Whitmore. Explains the situation, tells him you'll get to Helena once the road's open. Clara hadn't even thought about Samuel in days. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm doing this for the valley, not for you. But his voice softened slightly. Though I suppose keeping you alive until you can get married is part of that. I'm not sure I'm getting married anymore. The words surprised them both. Cole looked at her sharply. What? I've been thinking about it. About what Ruth told me. About the kind of man who'd treat his wives the way Sam Whitmore apparently did. Clara met his eyes. I came west looking for a better life. I'm not sure marrying him would give me that. So what will you do? I don't know yet. It was the truth. For the first time since leaving Boston, Clara had no clear plan for the future. The uncertainty should have terrified her. Instead, it felt almost liberating. But I have time to figure it out. Cole studied her for a long moment. Then he touched his hat brim in that same almost polite gesture she'd seen before. Good luck, Miss Bennett. Clara, if you're riding into the wilderness to save my life and everyone else's, you can call me Clara. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper she couldn't name. Clara, then. I'm Cole. I know. She managed to smile. Ride safe, Cole Mercer, and come back alive. The valley needs you. The valley needs a lot of things. I'm just one man. But he gathered his reins and turned the gray horse north. Keep working on Ruth's books, and stay away from Blackthorn's men. They're going to get more aggressive once they figure out what we're doing. Then he was gone, disappearing into the trees that lined the creek. Clara watched until she couldn't see him anymore, then went back inside to help Ruth with breakfast. She didn't expect to see him again for at least 2 weeks. She saw him again in 5 days, and he wasn't alone. Clara was in the boarding house kitchen when she heard horses outside. Lots of them. She looked out the window and felt her stomach drop. At least a dozen men on horseback filled the street. Most wore the rough clothes of miners or ranch hands, but a few were dressed better. hired guns, based on the way they carried themselves and the quality of their weapons. And in the middle of them all sat a man in an expensive suit who could only be Victor Hale. Ruth appeared beside her. Hell. What do we do? Nothing stupid. Ruth headed for the front door. Let me handle this. But before Ruth could reach the porch, someone kicked open the door. Two of Hale's men pushed inside, guns drawn. Everyone downstairs, one of them shouted. Now! Clara heard crying from the upper floor, children frightened by the noise. Then footsteps as the Morrison family and other residents came down, terrified and confused. Hale entered last, moving with the casual confidence of someone who knew he controlled the situation. He was younger than Clara expected, maybe 40, with neat hair and cold eyes that evaluated everything like a ledger. Mrs. Calloway, he said pleasantly, I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but I understand you've been harboring some interesting documents. I'd like to see them. I don't know what you're talking about. Ruth's voice was steady, but Clara saw her hands trembling. Please don't insult my intelligence. I have eyes all over this valley. Hale's smile didn't reach his eyes. A rancher named Cole Mercer has been collecting testimony against my company. He was supposed to deliver it to Fort Benson via the northern route, but we caught him trying to cross Devil's Pass 3 days ago. Claire's heart stopped. What did you do to him? Hale turned his attention to her. And you must be Miss Bennett, the mail-order bride who never made it to Helena. I've heard about you. He circled her slowly. Smart girl, from what I understand. Good with numbers. Tell me, did you help compile that little collection of lies Mercer was carrying? They're not lies. Ah, so you did help. Hale nodded to one of his men. Search the house. Every room, every trunk, every hiding place. I want those documents and anything else that looks like evidence. You can't just, Ruth started. I can do whatever I want. Hale's pleasant mask dropped. This is my valley, my mines, my suppliers, my sheriff. The only thing I don't control yet is the land, and I'm working on that. Now where are the documents? Nobody answered. Hale's men tore through the boarding house, overturning furniture, ripping open mattresses, dumping drawers onto the floor. The Morrison children cried. Their mother tried to comfort them while their father stood helpless and furious. After 20 minutes, one of Hale's men emerged from the office. Found them, boss. 3 copies, all identical. Hale took the papers and flipped through them, his expression darkening with each page. This is quite a collection. Names, dates, specific accusations. He looked at Clara. You really are good with numbers. What did you do to Cole? Clara demanded again. Mr. Mercer is currently enjoying our hospitality at the mine headquarters. Unharmed for now, though that could change depending on how cooperative everyone decides to be. Hale handed the documents to one of his men. Burn these, all of them. No! Clara lunged forward, but one of the guards caught her arm and twisted it behind her back. Pain shot through her shoulder. Let her go, Ruth said sharply. In a moment. Hale stepped closer to Clara. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to forget this little rebellion ever occurred. And in return, you're all going to stop asking questions, stop collecting information, and stop causing problems. If you do that, Mr. Mercer lives. If you don't, he shrugged. Accidents happen in mines all the time. You're a monster, Clara spat. I'm a businessman. There's a difference. Hale nodded to the guard who released Clara's arm. She stumbled forward, catching herself on a chair. You have 24 hours to convince everyone in this valley to cooperate. After that, people start getting hurt. Are we clear? Nobody answered, which Hale seemed to take as agreement. He tipped his hat to Ruth. Always a pleasure, Mrs. Calloway. I hope we don't have to repeat this conversation. Then he and his men were gone, taking the documents with them. The boarding house descended into chaos. Children crying, adults shouting, Mrs. Morrison having what looked like a panic attack while her husband tried to calm her. Clara sank into a chair, her arm throbbing and her mind racing. Cole was captured. The evidence was gone. And Blackthorn now knew exactly who was organizing against them. Ruth appeared with a glass of whiskey. Drink. Clara took it and downed it in one swallow, coughing as it burned her throat. We have to get him out. Get who out? Cole. From wherever they're holding him. Clara stood, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. We can't just leave him there. Clara, they have at least 20 armed men at the mine headquarters. What are we supposed to do, storm the place? If we have to, Clara started pacing. They're expecting us to roll over and accept this. That's their whole strategy. Terrorize people until they're too afraid to fight back. But if we rescue Cole and get those documents to the governor, the documents are ash by now. So we recreate them. I remember most of it. We can get new testimony, new signatures. Clara turned to Ruth. But first we need Cole back. He's the only one who knows those mountains well enough to make the ride. And more importantly, we can't let Hale think he can just take people and threaten their lives whenever someone stands up to him. Ruth studied her for a long moment. You've changed since you got here. I had to. Clara felt something hard and cold settling in her chest. I spent my whole life letting people push me around because I thought keeping my head down was how you survive. But out here, keeping your head down just makes you an easier target. So what's your plan? I'm still working on that part. Clara looked around the room at the frightened families. But I know we can't do nothing. Hale expects us to be scared. Let's give him something else to think about. The plan came together over the next 12 hours in Ruth's kitchen, assembled from desperation and whatever scraps of courage they could scrape together. Clara spread a hand-drawn map across the table. The mine headquarters is here, about 3 miles northeast. Hale keeps his armed men there along with the administrative offices. She pointed to a cluster of buildings. If they're holding coal anywhere, it'll be in one of the storage sheds behind the main structure. They're solid enough to lock someone in, but far enough from the workers' barracks that nobody would hear him. That's a lot of guessing, Patterson said. The rancher had shown up an hour after Hale left, along with 5 other men who'd been part of the testimony gathering. They stood around Ruth's table looking grim and armed. It's educated guessing based on what I learned from the mining company's supply records. Clara had spent the evening reconstructing everything she knew about Blackthorn's operation from the invoices and receipts that passed through Ruth's books. They order padlocks and chain from the same supplier who does prison contracts. Those supplies go to the storage area, not the mine shafts. Still doesn't tell us how many men are guarding him, another rancher said. No, but I know they rotate shifts at midnight and dawn. Hale mentioned he has about 20 men total. Figure half are sleeping at any given time. Another quarter are actually working the active mines. That leaves maybe 5 or 6 watching the headquarters. Clara looked up. Those are bad odds, but they're better than 20. Patterson rubbed his jaw. You're talking about attacking a fortified position with 6 farmers and a bookkeeper. I'm talking about getting one man out before Hale makes good on his threat. Clara kept her voice level. If anyone has a better idea, I'm listening. Nobody did. The silence stretched until Ruth broke it. I might know a way in that doesn't involve a frontal assault, she said quietly. The mine headquarters used to be a boarding house before Blackthorn bought it. There's a root cellar with an exterior entrance on the north side. If it's not blocked off, you could get inside without being seen. That's a big if, Patterson said. It's also the only if we have. Clara started rolling up the map. We go tonight. Midnight, when they're changing shifts and everyone's distracted. Ruth, I need you to create a diversion in town, something to pull attention south. What kind of diversion? I don't know. A fire, a fight, anything loud enough that Hale's men in town come running and maybe pull some guards from the headquarters to help. Clara looked at the assembled ranchers. The rest of you will create a perimeter. If shooting starts, you return fire and cover our escape. But the goal is to get in and out without anyone knowing we were there until morning. Our escape, Patterson repeated. You're going in? I'm the one who knows what Cole looks like and where he's likely being held. Plus, I'm small enough to fit through spaces you can't. Clara met his skeptical gaze. Unless you want to volunteer? Nobody did. Clara tried not to take it personally. These were farmers and ranchers, not soldiers. The fact that they'd shown up at all meant more than she'd expected. Fine. I'll need one person to come with me. Someone who can handle themselves if things go wrong. She looked around the table. I'll go. The speaker was a young man named Thomas, maybe 25, with a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder and a determined set to his jaw. I owe Cole. He helped me get my homestead claim filed when the land office was trying to cheat me. Clara nodded. Then it's settled. We leave at 11. The hours before departure dragged like years. Clara tried to rest but couldn't stop her mind from spinning through everything that could go wrong. She'd never done anything like this. The closest she'd come to violence was watching street fights in Boston from her aunt's window. Now she was planning a raid on an armed compound to rescue a man she barely knew. Ruth found her sitting in the dark parlor around 10 o'clock. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." "Why?" "You could wait out the winter, go to Helena, marry your rich rancher, and forget Bloodstone Valley ever existed." Ruth sat down beside her. "Nobody would blame you." "I would blame me." Clara stared at her hands. "I spent 23 years being the person who kept her head down and did what she was told. I thought that was strength, surviving by not making waves. But it's not strength. It's just fear dressed up as practicality." "And you're not afraid now?" "I'm terrified." Clara's voice cracked slightly. "But I'm more afraid of being the person who could have helped and chose not to." Cole risked his life trying to get justice for people he doesn't even know. The least I can do is try to get him back alive. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "He's lucky to have you fighting for him." "He doesn't have me. Not like that." Clara stood and checked the knife Margaret had given her weeks ago. It felt heavier than she remembered. "But he has someone who won't leave him to die. That'll have to be enough." At 11, Clara and Thomas set out on foot. The ranchers had already positioned themselves in the woods surrounding the mine headquarters, ready to provide covering fire if needed. Ruth had promised to start the diversion at midnight sharp. The walk through darkness was nerve-shredding. Every sound made Clara flinch. Wind in the trees, an owl calling, the distant howl of something that might have been a wolf. Thomas moved quietly beside her, rifle ready, his eyes scanning the shadows. The mine headquarters materialized out of the dark like a sleeping predator. Lights burned in a few windows, and Clara could see two men standing near the main entrance, smoking and talking in low voices. She and Thomas circled wide to the north side, staying low and moving slowly. The root cellar entrance was still there, a slanted wooden door set into the ground, half buried under snow. Clara brushed it clear with shaking hands and tried the handle. Locked. "Damn it," she whispered. Thomas pulled out a pry bar. "Step back." He worked the bar into the gap between door and frame, leveraging carefully to avoid making noise. The wood groaned softly, then gave way with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. They both froze, listening. Nothing changed in the compound. The guards kept talking. Clara pulled open the door and peered into darkness. Stone steps led down into a cellar that smelled like earth and old vegetables. She climbed down carefully, Thomas following and pulling the door closed behind them. Once inside, Clara lit the small lantern she'd brought. The weak light showed a cramped space filled with crates and barrels, food storage mostly, along with mining equipment. A wooden door at the far end presumably led into the main building. She tried it, also locked, but this one had a simple latch she could see through the gap. Clara pulled out the knife and worked it into the crack, wiggling the blade until she felt the latch lift. The door swung open. They stepped into a hallway that ran along the back of the building. More doors branched off on either side. Offices, based on the desks visible through grimy windows. Clara moved forward slowly, checking each room. The third door was different. It had a padlock on the outside and no window. Clara pressed her ear against the wood and heard breathing, slow and labored, like someone hurt or exhausted. "Cole?" she whispered. A pause. Then a voice rough from disuse. "Clara?" Relief flooded through her so strongly she nearly dropped the lantern. "We're getting you out. Hold on." The padlock was solid iron, too strong for her knife or Thomas's pry bar. Clara looked around frantically for something else. A key, a tool, anything. "Storage shed," Cole's voice came through the door. "They keep keys in the storage shed, third building from the main office. Guard usually leaves them hanging on a hook inside the door." "How do you know that?" "I've been listening to them talk for 3 days. They're not subtle." A pause. "Clara, there are at least 6 men upstairs and more in the barracks. You need to leave before they realize you're here. Not without you." Clara looked at Thomas. "Can you get those keys?" "I can try." Thomas headed back the way they'd come, moving quietly despite his size. Clara stayed by the door, listening to Cole breathe on the other side. "Are you hurt?" "Bruised ribs, maybe a cracked one. They weren't gentle when they caught me." His voice was strained. "They took the documents." "I know. Hale came to the boarding house, burned everything." Clara swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, all that work." "Doesn't matter. I memorized most of it. We can recreate it once I'm out of here. A bitter laugh. If I get out of here, you will. I promise. Don't make promises you can't keep. Before Clara could respond, she heard shouting from outside. Then an explosion, Ruth's diversion, right on time. The noise was followed by more shouting and the sound of men running. Thomas reappeared, breathing hard and holding a ring of keys. Fire in town, big one. Most of the guards just left. Clara grabbed the keys and tried them one by one in the padlock. The fourth one clicked. She yanked the lock free and pulled open the door. Cole sat against the far wall, face bruised and dried blood crusting one side of his head. He squinted against the lantern light. You're insane. Probably. Clara moved to help him stand. He was heavier than she expected, and his sharp intake of breath told her the broken rib wasn't a maybe. Can you walk? Can I do anything else? Cole got his feet under him with Thomas's help. We need to move fast. Once they realize the fire's a diversion, gunfire erupted outside. Not the distant sound of the diversion, but close, right outside the building. They know, Thomas said. Back door, Cole said. There's a service exit on the east side. Leads to the equipment yard. They moved as quickly as Cole's injuries allowed, which wasn't very fast. Clara could hear shouting getting closer, boots pounding on wooden floors above them. They reached the service exit just as someone started down the stairs behind them. The equipment yard was chaos. Mining carts, broken tools, piles of lumber, and 3 of Hale's men running toward them with guns drawn. Stop right there, one of them shouted. Patterson and 2 other ranchers appeared from the tree line, rifles raised. Drop your weapons! For one frozen moment, nobody moved. Then someone fired. Clara couldn't tell which side, and everything exploded into violence. And Clara hit the ground, pulling Cole down with her. Thomas fired his rifle, the sound deafening in the confined space. One of Hale's men went down screaming. The other 2 scattered for cover. Run! Patterson shouted, laying down covering fire. Clara hauled Cole to his feet and half-dragged him toward the trees. Thomas ran beside them, stopping every few steps to fire behind them. Bullets tore through the air, splintering wood and kicking up snow. They made it to the tree line just as more guards poured out of the headquarters. Clara didn't stop running. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, and Cole was getting heavier with every step. Behind them, gunfire continued. The ranchers buying them time with their lives, maybe. They crashed through underbrush and stumbled over roots hidden by snow. Clara lost her footing and fell hard, losing her grip on Cole. He went down beside her, groaning in pain. Can't stop, he gasped. They'll track us. I know. Clara forced herself up and grabbed him again. Thomas appeared on Cole's other side, and together they got him moving. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The gunfire faded behind them, replaced by shouting and the baying of dogs. Hale had tracking hounds. Of course he did. We need to lose the trail, Thomas said. Water, is there a stream nearby? 1/4 mile north, Cole said through gritted teeth, but it's frozen. Frozen's fine. We walk on the ice, they lose the scent. Thomas adjusted his grip on Cole. Can you make it that far? Don't have much choice. They found the stream exactly where Cole said it would be, a narrow ribbon of ice cutting through the forest. Clara tested it carefully with her weight. It held. They moved onto it single file, Thomas in front, Clara supporting Cole, all of them trying not to slip. The ice creaked but didn't break. They followed it north for maybe half a mile before Cole stopped them. There. That outcropping. He pointed to a rock formation jutting from the stream bank. There's a space behind it. Used to hide there when I was scouting. We can wait out the search. The space turned out to be barely large enough for 3 people, but it was dry and hidden from casual view. They squeezed inside and sat in the dark, listening to the dogs get closer. Clara's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Beside her, Cole's breathing was ragged and painful. Thomas kept his rifle pointed at the entrance, ready for a fight they probably couldn't win. The dogs reached the stream. Clara heard them circling, confused by the lack of scent. Men shouted, frustrated. Someone suggested splitting up to check both directions. They went north, another voice said. That's where Mercer's ranch is. He's heading home. Then let's go get him. That was Hale's voice, cold and precise. And this time, we make sure everyone knows what happens to people who interfere with my business. Footsteps moved away. The dogs followed, their baying growing distant. But Clara didn't dare move. They stayed frozen in the dark for another hour before Cole finally spoke. They're gone. For now? Thomas didn't lower his rifle. But they know where you live. They'll be waiting. Probably. Cole shifted position and winced. Which means I can't go home. Not until this is settled one way or another. Where will you go? Clara asked. There's an old line shack about 10 miles west. Nobody's used it in years, but it's got a roof and walls. I can hole up there. He looked at Clara. You need to get back to Ruth's place. Make sure everyone knows what happened, and start rebuilding those documents. I'm not leaving you alone and injured in some abandoned shack. You don't have a choice. If Hale finds out you helped me escape, he'll kill you. Cole's voice was flat. I won't have that on my conscience. And I won't have your death on mine. Clara met his eyes in the darkness. We're past the point of making safe choices, Cole. Hale threatened to kill you if we didn't cooperate. We didn't cooperate. Now he's hunting us both. Splitting up doesn't make either of us safer. She's right, Thomas said. And besides, that line shack you're thinking of? Hale's men use it sometimes. I've seen them there. You go alone? You're walking into a trap. Cole was silent for a long moment. Then where do we go? My family's ranch, Thomas said. It's remote, and my father's got 6 sons who can shoot. Hale's men come around, they'll get a fight they're not expecting. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than freezing in a cave or walking into an ambush. They waited another hour to be safe, then emerged into a night grown even colder. The stars were out, sharp and bright against the black sky. The walk to Thomas's family ranch took most of the remaining night. Cole's strength faded with each mile, until he was barely conscious and leaning heavily on Clara and Thomas both. When they finally reached the ranch house, a sturdy log structure with smoke rising from its chimney, dawn was breaking gray and cold over the mountains. Thomas's father met them at the door with a shotgun. He took one look at Cole's condition and his son's expression and stood aside. Bring him in. Emma, heat water. Peter, get the medical kit. He looked at Clara. You the mail-order bride everyone's talking about? That's me. Clara helped ease Cole onto a bench near the fire. And right now, I'm the reason Blackthorn Mining is probably going to burn this valley to the ground. About time someone gave them a reason. Thomas's father set down the shotgun. Name's Jack Hayes. You're welcome here for as long as you need. Over the next few hours, Clara watched the Hayes family mobilize with the efficiency of people who'd survived on the frontier for generations. Emma, Thomas's mother, tended Cole's injuries with competent hands while her husband posted his sons around the property as lookouts. The youngest boy, maybe 12, was sent to town with messages for Ruth and the other ranchers. Clara sat by the fire, too exhausted to move but too keyed up to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw gunfire and heard dogs baying. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Emma noticed. She pressed a cup of something hot into Clara's hands. Drink. It'll help. What is it? Tea with whiskey, old frontier medicine. Emma sat down beside her. Thomas told me what you did. That was either very brave or very stupid. Both, probably. Clara sipped the tea and felt warmth spread through her chest. I keep waiting to feel afraid, but all I feel is angry. Good. Anger's useful. Fear just gets you killed. Emma looked at Cole, who was sleeping now, bandaged and pale. He's lucky you came for him. I'm not sure luck has anything to do with what's happening here. Clara stared into the fire. Hale's going to retaliate. We humiliated him, stole his prisoner, killed at least one of his men. He can't let that stand. No, he can't. Jack Hayes had been listening from across the room. Which means we need to be ready. Thomas, get the spare rifles from the cellar. Emma, inventory our ammunition. We're going to need every bullet we've got. You think he'll attack here? Clara asked. I think we just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory. Jack's expression was grim. War doesn't end until one side surrenders or dies, and I don't plan on surrendering. The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. The Hayes boys reinforced doors and windows, stockpiled firewood and food, positioned water barrels in case of fire. It reminded Clara of stories she'd heard about medieval sieges, people preparing to survive inside walls while enemies waited outside. Cole woke around noon, groggy and in pain, but conscious. He listened to Jack's preparations and nodded approval. Hale won't come today, he said. He'll want to gather more men first, make sure we can't escape. Tomorrow? Maybe the day after. That gives us time. Time for what? Clara asked. To finish what we started. Cole tried to sit up and failed, settling back with a grimace. The documents. We need to recreate them and get them to the territorial governor before Hale can stop us again. You can barely move, Clara pointed out. You're not riding anywhere. I know, but you can. Cole looked at her. You know what was in those documents better than anyone. You could recreate them from memory, get new signatures, make the ride north. Through the same mountains that nearly killed you the first time? I'll draw you a map. Tell you where the dangerous passes are, which routes to avoid. His voice was urgent now. Clara, we're running out of time. Every day Hale consolidates power. It gets harder to stop him. Someone has to make that ride. He's right, Jack said, though I'm not sure sending a woman alone through winter mountains is the best plan. I'll go with her. Thomas stepped forward. I know those trails well enough, and if trouble finds us, I can shoot. Emma looked at her son with an expression Clara recognized, fear wrapped in pride, the look of a mother watching her child walk into danger. The hell you will, she said quietly. You're not risking your life for what? Justice? Stopping a tyrant who's destroying our valley? Thomas met his mother's eyes. Ma, we can't keep our heads down and hope this passes. If we don't fight now, there won't be anything left to fight for. The silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid. Finally, Emma nodded once, sharp and painful. Then you take care of her, she said, and you come back alive. Clara spent the evening reconstructing the documents from memory, her hand cramping as she wrote page after page of testimony. Thomas sat across from her, cleaning his rifle and checking supplies for the journey. Outside, the Hayes boys maintained their watch as night fell and temperature plummeted. Around midnight, the youngest boy came running inside. Riders approaching, at least 20 of them. Everyone grabbed weapons. Jack positioned his sons at windows while Emma shepherded the younger children into the cellar. Cole tried to stand, managed it with Clara's help, and accepted a pistol from Jack. If they want to fight, Jack said, we'll give them one they remember. But the riders stopped 100 yards from the house, just visible in the moonlight. They sat on their horses in a line, not attacking but making their presence known. Then Hale's voice carried through the cold air, amplified somehow. Maybe a speaking trumpet. Cole Mercer, I know you're in there, and I know you've got help from the Hayes family. A pause. Here's my offer. You come out now, alone, and I'll leave everyone else in peace. You have 1 hour to decide. After that, we burn this place to the ground with everyone inside. Clara looked at Cole. Don't even think about it. He'll kill innocent people if I don't. He'll kill them anyway. Jack's voice was flat. Men like Hale don't make deals in good faith. You walk out there, you die. Then he burns the house anyway to make sure there are no witnesses. He's right, Thomas said. This is just Hale trying to isolate you, make you feel responsible for what he's about to do. Don't give him that satisfaction. Cole stared out the window at the line of armed riders. Clara saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weight of other people's lives against his own. How much ammunition do we have? He finally asked. Enough for a fight, Jack said. Not enough for a siege. Then we don't let it become a siege. Cole turned to Thomas. You and Clara leave now, out the back, into the forest. There's a trail that leads north. I'll show you on the map. Stay off the main routes and you should be clear before dawn. We're not leaving you to die, Clara said. You're not leaving me to anything. I'll be here helping Jack defend his family. Cole grabbed her shoulders, his grip strong despite the pain it must have caused him. But none of this means anything if those documents don't reach the governor. So you're going to take what you've written, get new testimony from the northern families, and finish what we started. Understand? Clara wanted to argue. Wanted to say they could fight together, survive together. But the look in Cole's eyes told her he'd already made his decision. 1 hour, she said. That's how long Hale's giving you. In 1 hour, Thomas and I will be in those trees heading north. That's when you fight back. When we're clear, and Hale's focused on you. You buy us time to escape, and we'll buy you justice. Deal? Cole studied her face for a long moment. Then he pulled her into a brief, fierce embrace that made his ribs scream, but which he didn't cut short. Deal, he whispered against her hair. Now go save this valley. Clara and Thomas spent the next 45 minutes preparing for a journey that would either save Bloodstone or get them both killed. Emma packed food that would keep in the cold. Jack provided ammunition and a spare rifle. The Hayes boys drew maps and shared knowledge of the northern routes. And Cole sat with Clara in the kitchen, sketching the path she needed to take. Which passes were safe, which streams to follow, where to find shelter if a storm hit. "It's a hard ride," he said. 10 days minimum, maybe 2 weeks if the weather turns. You'll be cold, hungry, and exhausted. But if you keep moving and trust your instincts, you'll make it. "And when I get there?" Clara asked. "Find the territorial governor's office. Give them the documents. Don't leave until someone in authority promises to investigate." He met her eyes. "And if they won't help, find a newspaper. Get the story printed. Sometimes public shame works better than legal pressure." "What about you?" "I'll be fine. Jack and I have held worse positions against worse odds." The lie was obvious, but Clara appreciated the effort. "Just come back when you're done. The valley will need rebuilding, and I'm not good at that kind of work. But you are." Clara wanted to say something profound, something that captured how much had changed in the few weeks since she'd arrived in Bloodstone. But words felt inadequate, so she just nodded and squeezed his hand. At 55 minutes, she and Thomas slipped out the back door into darkness. They moved quickly through the forest, following the trail Cole had described. Behind them, the Hayes Ranch glowed with lamplight, a target waiting for the violence about to descend on it. Clara didn't look back. If she looked back, she might not be able to keep moving. They were half a mile into the trees when they heard the first gunshots. Not scattered fire, but a sustained barrage. Hale's men attacking, the Hayes family defending. Clara's steps faltered. "Keep moving," Thomas said quietly. "That's what they're buying with those bullets. Don't waste it." So Clara kept moving, even as tears froze on her cheeks, and smoke began to rise behind them into the dawn sky. She kept moving because stopping meant Cole's sacrifice was for nothing. She kept moving because somewhere ahead was a governor who might listen and a valley that needed saving. She kept moving because the girl who'd stepped off that stagecoach scared and alone didn't exist anymore. And the woman she'd become didn't know how to quit. The mountains tried to kill them on the third day. Clara and Thomas had been making good time despite the cold, following Cole's mapped route through passes he'd marked as safe. They traveled at night when possible to avoid being spotted, slept in whatever shelter they could find during the day. The food Emma packed was running low, but they'd supplemented it by snaring rabbits and melting snow for water. Then the weather turned. The storm came out of nowhere, one moment clear sky, the next a wall of white that erased the world. Wind hit them like a physical blow, nearly knocking Clara off her horse. Snow flew horizontal, stinging exposed skin and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "We need shelter," Thomas shouted over the wind. "Where?" Clara could barely make out his shape next to her. "I don't know. Just keep moving." They pushed forward blindly, trusting the horses to find footing they couldn't see. Clara's fingers went numb inside her gloves. Ice formed in her eyelashes. The cold penetrated every layer of clothing until she couldn't remember what warmth felt like. After what might have been an hour or 3, time lost meaning in the whiteout. Thomas's horse stopped moving. Clara nearly crashed into him. "There!" He pointed at something she couldn't see. "Rock face! There might be an overhang!" They dismounted and led the horses forward by feel. Clara's hand hit stone, rough and solid. She followed it right and found what Thomas had spotted. A shallow cave, barely deep enough to get out of the wind, but better than nothing. They crowded inside with the horses, all 4 of them shaking from cold. Thomas unpacked their remaining supplies with hands that wouldn't work properly. No chance of a fire. Everything was too wet, and the smoke would suffocate them in the enclosed space. "How long will this last?" Clara's teeth chattered so hard she could barely form words. "No idea. Could be an hour, could be days." Thomas pulled out a blanket and wrapped it around both of them. "We just have to wait it out." They huddled together in the dark, sharing body heat with each other and the horses. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, too cold to sleep properly, but too exhausted to stay fully awake. She dreamed of fire and warm rooms and Cole's face in the lamplight before the shooting started. When she jerked awake, Thomas was shaking her. Clara, wake up. Something's wrong." She struggled to focus. The storm had died down to scattered flurries. Gray daylight filtered into the cave. And Thomas was staring at something outside with an expression that made Clara's stomach drop. She followed his gaze and saw tracks in the fresh snow. Not human tracks. Something bigger, with paws the size of dinner plates. Bear? She whispered. Mountain lion, I think. And recent, these weren't here when the storm cleared. Thomas reached for his rifle slowly. We need to leave. Now. They packed in near silence, every sound amplified by fear. Clara kept expecting to see golden eyes watching from the rocks, but nothing appeared. They mounted and rode out of the cave, following their back trail until they could pick up Cole's route again. 2 hours later, they found the lion's kill, a deer torn apart and partially buried under snow. The big cat was probably sleeping it off somewhere nearby. They gave the area a wide berth and didn't stop moving until nightfall. That night, camped in a stand of pine trees that offered minimal protection, Thomas cleaned his rifle while Clara worked on the documents by firelight. You really think this will matter? He asked. All these papers and testimony? It has to. Clara didn't look up from her writing. Because if it doesn't, then Cole's risking his life for nothing. The Hayes family is fighting for nothing. And we're freezing in these mountains for nothing. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. Clara set down her pen and looked at him. You want me to say I'm certain this will work? That the governor will read these documents and immediately send troops to arrest Hale? I can't promise that, but I can promise that doing nothing guarantees Hale wins. At least this way we're fighting back. Thomas was quiet for a moment. My father said something similar once, after our first winter here, when we nearly starved and thought about going back east. He said giving up was the only sure way to fail. Everything else was just different kinds of trying. Smart man. He has his moments. Thomas went back to cleaning his rifle. Think they're still alive? Cole and my family? Clara had been avoiding that question for 3 days. I don't know. But Cole survived worse, and your father seemed like someone who knows how to handle himself in a fight. Yeah. Thomas didn't sound convinced. Yeah, you're probably right. They reached the northern settlements on the 7th day, half frozen and running on fumes. The first ranch they came to belonged to a family named Peterson, German immigrants who'd been in the valley for a decade. Mrs. Peterson took one look at Clara and Thomas and immediately pulled them inside. You look half dead, she said in accented English. Sit, I make food. While she bustled around the kitchen, Mr. Peterson listened to their story with a grim expression. When Clara showed him the documents, he nodded slowly. We heard about the trouble down south. Hale's men came through here last month trying to buy land. When we said no, they made threats. He looked at his wife. We were thinking about selling anyway. This valley is getting too dangerous. That's exactly what Hale wants, Clara said. He's trying to scare everyone into leaving so he can take over completely. But if we can get this evidence to the territorial governor, the governor is 3 weeks away by good roads, and there are no good roads. Peterson shook his head. Even if you reach him, even if he listens, by the time any help arrives, we'll all be dead or gone. So you're just going to surrender? Thomas's voice was sharp with frustration. Let Hale win? I'm going to keep my family alive. Peterson's tone was final. That's what matters. They had similar conversations at 4 more ranches. Some families were sympathetic, but scared. Others had already decided to leave come spring. A few were openly hostile, viewing Clara and Thomas as troublemakers who'd brought Hale's attention to the valley. Only 2 families agreed to sign the new testimony. 2 out of 15. On the 9th night, Clara sat by their campfire, staring at the pathetically thin stack of documents. She'd risked everything. Cole had risked everything for this. And it wasn't enough. We could go back, Thomas said quietly. Tell Cole we tried. Help with whatever's left of the resistance. Or we could keep going. Clara looked at Cole's map, studying the route to Fort Benson. We're more than halfway there. And even without new testimony, we have enough to make a case. It's not as strong as I wanted, but it's something. Clara, we're out of food. The horses are exhausted, and there's another storm coming. I can feel it. Thomas gestured at the darkening sky. We push on now. We might not make it at all. He was right. Clara knew he was right. But the thought of turning back, of telling Cole she'd failed, was worse than the thought of dying in the snow. 1 more day? She said. We go 1 more day. If we don't find better conditions or more help, we turn back. Deal? Thomas sighed. 1 more day. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold that turned every breath into a cloud of ice. They rode in silence, conserving energy, watching for any sign of civilization or shelter. Around noon, they crested a ridge and saw smoke rising in the distance. "That's a lot of fires," Thomas said. "Too many for a ranch." They approached cautiously and found themselves looking down at a logging camp, maybe 30 men working to clear timber from the mountainside. A rough settlement had sprung up around the operation. Bunkhouses, a cookhouse, storage buildings. "Think they'll help us?" Claire asked. "Only one way to find out." They rode into camp expecting hostility, but found curiosity instead. The foreman, a massive Swede named Larson, listened to their story while his men gathered around. "Blackthorn Mining," he said, spitting into the snow. "We know them. They tried to buy this timber contract out from under us last year. When we wouldn't sell, they sent men to sabotage our equipment." "Did you report it?" Clara asked. "To who?" "The sheriff works for them." Larson crossed his arms. "But we fought back, caught 2 of their men trying to burn our sawmill, held them until they confessed who sent them. After that, Blackthorn left us alone. They don't like fighting people who fight back." Clara felt something shift in her chest, the first glimmer of hope she'd had in days. "Would you testify to that? Put your name on a document saying Blackthorn attempted sabotage and arson." "I would. And I know 5 other camps that had similar problems. If you're collecting evidence against Hale, we'll sign." Larson looked at his men. "Anyone here object to that?" Nobody did. In fact, several stepped forward volunteering information about Blackthorn's intimidation tactics, corrupt business practices, and violence against workers who tried to unionize. Clara spent the next 6 hours writing testimony and gathering signatures. By the time she finished, she had statements from 43 men representing 7 different logging operations. The documents had gone from pathetically thin to substantial enough to demand attention. "This is good work," Larson said, reading through the final compilation. "But getting it to the territorial capital is still going to be hell. The main road's been closed since December. We're not using the main road. We're going through the northern pass to Fort Benson, then catching the rail line east." Clara folded the documents carefully and secured them in the waterproof case Cole had given her weeks ago. "At least, that's the plan. That pass is treacherous this time of year. You'll need a guide who knows it." Larson turned to his men. "Anyone here willing to make that ride?" A young logger named Eric volunteered. "I grew up near Fort Benson. Know those trails like my own hand. I can get them through." "Then take supplies and one of the fast horses." Larson clasped Eric's shoulder. "And be careful. If Blackthorn finds out what you're carrying, they'll kill you for it." "They can try." Eric grinned, the cocky confidence of someone too young to understand mortality. "But they'll have to catch me first." With Eric's help, they made Fort Benson in 4 days instead of the week Clara had feared. The town was larger than anything she'd seen since leaving Boston. Actual streets, brick buildings, a train station with smoke rising from locomotives getting ready to depart. Clara stood on the platform, clutching her documents and feeling suddenly, absurdly nervous. She'd crossed mountains, survived storms, escaped armed mercenaries. But now, facing the prospect of presenting her case to territorial officials, doubt crept in. "What if they don't listen?" she asked Thomas. "Then we make them listen." He squeezed her shoulder. "You didn't come this far to give up now." The territorial governor's office occupied a brick building near the center of town. Clara walked in with Thomas and Eric flanking her, documents clutched to her chest like armor. The secretary looked up from his desk with barely concealed annoyance. "Help you?" "I need to see the governor. It's urgent." "The governor is a busy man. If you have a petition or complaint, you can leave it with me, and this isn't a petition. This is evidence of systematic criminal activity being conducted by the Blackthorn Mining Company in the Southern Territories." Clara set the documents on his desk. Multiple counts of arson, extortion, assault, theft, and conspiracy to defraud settlers of their legal property rights. "I have testimony from over 60 witnesses and physical evidence of fraud." The secretary blinked. "I see. And you are?" "Clara Bennett. I've been documenting these crimes for the past month on behalf of the residents of Bloodstone Valley." She met his eyes. "And I'm not leaving until someone in authority agrees to investigate." The secretary stared at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the documents and started reading. His expression changed as he worked through the pages, from skepticism to surprise to something that might have been concern. "Wait here," he said finally, standing. "I'll speak to the governor." He disappeared into an inner office. Clara sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. Thomas offered her water from his canteen. She drank without tasting it. 20 minutes later, the secretary returned with an older man in a dark suit. The governor, Clara recognized him from newspaper sketches she'd seen back east. He held her documents and wore an expression she couldn't read. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I'm Governor Harrison. My secretary tells me you've brought some serious accusations against the Blackthorn Mining Company." "Not accusations. Evidence." Clara stood, forcing strength into her voice. "Everything in those documents is corroborated by multiple witnesses. Names, dates, specific incidents. And there's more that didn't make it into the report. Ongoing violence, intimidation, possibly even murder." Harrison flipped through the pages. "This is quite a collection. How did you compile it?" "With help from residents of Bloodstone Valley. People who are being systematically driven from their homes by a company that doesn't want witnesses to their illegal activities." Clara stepped forward. "Governor Harrison, I understand the mining companies have influence. But if you read those documents, really read them, you'll see this isn't just business competition. This is organized crime. And what do you expect me to do about it?" "Send investigators, federal marshals, anyone with authority to arrest Victor Hale and shut down his operation before more people die." Clara heard her voice shaking but didn't try to hide it. People are fighting and dying in that valley right now because they believe the law would protect them. Please don't prove them wrong. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then he looked at Thomas and Eric. "These men with you are witnesses?" "I am," Thomas said. "My family's ranch was attacked by Hale's men. They're probably still under siege while we stand here talking." "And you?" Harrison asked Eric. "I represent 7 logging camps that have all been targeted by Blackthorn for refusing to sell out. We've got our own testimony if you want it." Harrison turned back to Clara. "And you're certain of these accusations? Because if I investigate and find you've exaggerated or fabricated any of this, you'll face charges of your own." "I'm certain," Clara met his eyes. "Everything in those documents is true. I'll swear to it in court if necessary." "That may not be necessary." Harrison handed the documents to his secretary. "Make copies of everything. I want the originals secured in the territorial vault. Then send word to the federal marshal's office. Tell them I'm requesting an immediate investigation into the Blackthorn Mining Company's activities in the Southern Territories." Relief hit Clara so hard she nearly stumbled. Thomas caught her elbow. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me yet. An investigation takes time. And from what you've described, time is something those people don't have." Harrison's expression was grim. "I can send a message to Bloodstone Valley warning Hale that he's under investigation. That might make him back off temporarily, but getting federal marshals mobilized could take weeks." "Weeks those people don't have," Clara said. "There must be something faster." "There is. I could deputize a group of men and send them to Bloodstone with authority to arrest anyone involved in the violence. But that's essentially declaring martial law, and I'd need strong justification for such an extreme measure." "You have 63 witness statements and physical evidence of fraud. How much stronger justification do you need?" Harrison smiled slightly, the first warmth he'd shown. "You're persistent, I'll give you that. All right, I'll send a deputy marshal with a force of 20 armed men. They'll leave tomorrow morning and should reach Bloodstone in a week, weather permitting. That's the best I can do." It wasn't enough, but it was something. Clara nodded. "Thank you, Governor Harrison. The people of Bloodstone Valley won't forget this. Let's hope they're still alive to remember it." Harrison turned to his secretary. "Get started on those copies and find accommodations for Miss Bennett and her companions. They look like they could use rest." The secretary led them to a boarding house near the train station. Clara barely registered the room or the bed. She collapsed fully clothed and slept for 16 hours straight. When she woke, Thomas was sitting by the window watching the street. "How long was I out?" she asked. "Long enough that I started checking if you were still breathing." He handed her a plate with bread and cheese. "Governor sent word this morning. His men left at dawn heading for Bloodstone Valley. They'll be carrying arrest warrants for Victor Hale and anyone else they can identify as participating in the violence." Clara sat up, her body aching from the hard ride and sleeping in her clothes. "Did he say anything about survivors? Whether anyone from the valley has made it here?" "No news. But no news might be good news." Thomas didn't sound convinced. "The deputy marshal promised to send word once they reach Bloodstone and assess the situation." That could be another week. Clara forced herself to eat despite having no appetite. We should go back. Help however we can. Clara, we barely survived getting here. The horses are exhausted, we're out of supplies, and there's still Hale's men between us and Bloodstone. Thomas leaned forward. We did what we came to do. We got help. Now we have to trust the marshal to handle it. You trust the law to save people? Clara heard the bitterness in her own voice. The same law that let Hale operate for months while families were terrorized and killed? I trust that 20 armed deputies is better than 2 exhausted civilians. Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. Cole sent us here to get help. We got it. Don't throw that away by riding back into a war zone. He was right. Clara knew he was right. But the waiting felt like cowardice. She spent the next 3 days in Fort Benson feeling useless. She wrote additional documentation, gave a full statement to the territorial secretary, even spoke to a newspaper reporter who promised to run a story about corruption in the mining territories. But none of it felt like enough. On the 4th day, a telegram arrived at the governor's office. Clara and Thomas were summoned immediately. They found Harrison behind his desk, his expression unreadable. I received word from Deputy Marshal Carr, he said. His men reached Bloodstone Valley yesterday. Clara's heart hammered. And? The situation is worse than your documents indicated. Multiple structures burned, at least a dozen confirmed dead, many more missing. Hale's men had essentially taken over the town. Harrison paused. However, Marshal Carr reports that a resistance force led by Cole Mercer and Jack Hayes has been holding key positions and preventing total collapse. They've suffered casualties but remain operational. Cole's alive? The words came out barely above a whisper. As of yesterday, yes. He was injured but mobile. Harrison looked down at the telegram. Marshal Carr arrested Victor Hale and 17 of his associates. They're being held pending trial. He's also secured the mine operations and begun interviewing witnesses. Thomas let out a breath he'd probably been holding for days. My family. Your father and brothers are alive, your mother and sister as well. Their ranch took heavy damage, but they held their position. Harrison set down the telegram. Marshal Carr says to tell you they're asking about you constantly, and he specifically mentioned that Cole Mercer wants to know if Miss Bennett made it here safely. Something warm and painful expanded in Clara's chest. Can you send a reply? Already did. Told them you're both well and that your testimony was crucial to obtaining the arrest warrants. Harrison stood and came around the desk. Miss Bennett, what you did took remarkable courage. Most people would have stayed quiet or fled. You chose to fight back. I didn't have much choice. Staying quiet meant watching people die. There's always a choice. You made the right one. Harrison offered his hand. The territory owes you a debt. Clara shook his hand, still processing the news. Cole was alive. The Hayes family survived. Hale was under arrest. It was more than she dared hope for. But the relief was complicated by everything else. The lives lost, the homes destroyed, the trauma that would linger long after the physical damage was repaired. When can we go back? She asked. Marshal Carr says the situation should be stable in another few days. After that, travel should be relatively safe. Harrison returned to his desk. Though I'd strongly suggest you take the southern route instead of the mountain pass. It's longer but much less dangerous. Clara thought about that. The southern route would add a week to their journey, possibly more, but it would also give the marshal time to fully secure Bloodstone, and it would keep her and Thomas from risking their lives unnecessarily. The southern route, she agreed. When do we leave? They departed Fort Benson 6 days after arriving, this time with a small escort provided by the territorial government. The journey south was long and cold, but uneventful. No storms, no bandits, no mountain lions, just mile after mile of wilderness slowly giving way to more settled territory. Clara used the time to think about what came next. She'd left Boston planning to marry a man she'd never met, desperate for stability and a place to belong. That plan was ashes now. Even if Samuel Whitmore still wanted her, she couldn't imagine going to Helena and pretending the past months hadn't happened. Bloodstone Valley had changed her. She'd discovered strength she didn't know she had, and purpose she'd never experienced working in her aunt's household. Going back to being someone's wife, managing a household, and looking decorative felt like suffocation. But what was the alternative? Stay in Bloodstone and do what? The valley would need rebuilding, but that was ranchers' work, not hers. Ruth's boarding house might still need a bookkeeper, but was that enough? The questions circled in her head without answers. They reached Bloodstone Valley on a gray afternoon 2 weeks after leaving Fort Benson. Clara barely recognized it. The town showed signs of battle, burned buildings, bullet holes in walls, broken windows. But it also showed signs of recovery. People worked to clear debris, rebuild structures, restore some semblance of normal life. The mine operations were shut down, equipment standing idle under guard by territorial deputies. Thomas headed immediately for his family's ranch. Clara went to Ruth's boarding house and found it still standing, though scorched on one side where fire had tried and failed to take hold. Ruth answered the door and immediately pulled Clara into a fierce hug. "You made it," she said. "We weren't sure. There were rumors you'd died in the mountains." "Came close a few times." Clara stepped back and looked at Ruth's face. She looked older, exhausted, but alive. "How bad was it here?" "Bad. Morrison family lost their oldest son in the fighting. Patterson's barn burned with him inside. They think he was trying to save the horses. And old Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry, died from smoke when Hale's men torched the building next to hers." Ruth's voice was flat, reciting facts to avoid feeling them. "We lost 13 people total, another 20 injured, and that's just counting the ones we know about." Clara felt sick. "I'm sorry. If we'd moved faster, well, Aussie, don't. You did what you could, and it saved the rest of us." Ruth gestured toward the parlor. "Come on, there's someone who's been waiting to see you." Cole sat in Ruth's kitchen, his left arm in a sling and fresh bandages visible under his shirt. He looked up when Clara entered, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You're alive," he said quietly. "So are you." Clara wanted to run to him but forced herself to walk normally. "I wasn't sure. The last I saw, your ranch was under attack." "We held them off, barely." Cole stood slowly, favoring his injured side. "Jack lost his barn and most of his livestock, but the house survived. We all survived, though it was close." He studied her face. "You made it to the governor?" "I did. He sent marshals, they arrested Hale, and apparently my testimony is being used to build a federal case." Clara pulled out a chair and sat down before her legs gave out. "It's over. We won." "We survived," Cole corrected. "Not sure I'd call it winning." He was right. Looking at Ruth's exhausted face and thinking about the 13 dead and the families destroyed, this didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival bought with blood and trauma. "What happens now?" Clara asked. "Trials eventually. The marshals are collecting more evidence, interviewing witnesses. Hale and his men are being held in the territorial prison until then." Cole lowered himself back into his chair carefully. "And we rebuild. Try to put this valley back together." "Will people stay?" "Some will. Some already left. Some are still deciding." He looked at her. "What about you? You heading to Helena finally?" Clara thought about Samuel Whitmore and the life she'd planned. It felt like remembering someone else's dream. "No," she said. "I'm not going to Helena." Cole's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "What will you do?" "I don't know yet, but I know I'm not leaving Bloodstone." Clara met his gaze. "This valley needs rebuilding, and I'm good at organizing things. Seems like a waste to leave when I could actually be useful." Ruth made a noise that might have been approval. Cole just watched Clara for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. "The valley would be lucky to have you," he finally said. "The valley already has me." Clara surprised herself with how certain she sounded. "Question is whether you can tolerate having me around." For the first time in weeks, Cole almost smiled. "I think I can manage." Spring came late to Bloodstone Valley that year, as if the land itself needed time to recover from the violence winter had brought. Clara spent those first weeks after returning working alongside Ruth to transform the boarding house into something more than just shelter. They turned the parlor into a coordination center where families could register damage claims, apply for territorial rebuilding assistance, and access the relief funds Governor Harrison had authorized. Clara managed the paperwork with the same precision she'd once applied to her aunt's business accounts, except now every ledger entry represented a family trying to rebuild their lives. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking. She interviewed widows whose husbands had died defending their land, helped families calculate losses they couldn't afford to replace, and wrote letter after letter to territorial officials advocating for people who'd lost everything. Some nights she fell into bed too tired to dream. Other nights she lay awake thinking about the 13 graves on the hill outside town and wondering if she could have done something differently. Cole's ranch had survived mostly intact, though his barn needed rebuilding and he'd lost half his cattle to theft or slaughter during the siege. He spent long days repairing fences and structures, working despite injuries that hadn't fully healed. Clara saw him in town occasionally, usually buying supplies or meeting with other ranchers to coordinate grazing territories, now that Blackthorn's fraudulent claims had been invalidated. They didn't talk much during those early weeks. When they did, conversation stayed practical. Who needed help? What resources were available? How the territorial investigation was progressing. But Clara felt his presence like a compass point, something steady she could orient herself by when everything else felt chaotic. 6 weeks after Hale's arrest, the territorial marshal sent word that the trial was scheduled. Clara would need to testify. She traveled to the territorial capital with Ruth and Thomas, the three of them crammed into a wagon for the 5-day journey. The city was bigger than Fort Benson, with proper streets and buildings that reached 3 stories. Clara had dreamed of places like this back in Boston. Civilized, established, safe. Now it just felt crowded and artificial. The trial took place in a courthouse that smelled like old wood and nervous sweat. Victor Hale sat at the defendant's table looking smaller than Clara remembered, his expensive suit rumpled and his confident smile replaced by tight-lipped anxiety. 17 of his men faced charges alongside him. Clara testified for 3 hours. She walked the prosecutor through the documents she'd compiled, explained how she'd gathered testimony, and answered questions about specific incidents of violence and intimidation. Hale's lawyer tried to rattle her with aggressive cross-examination, suggesting she'd fabricated evidence or exaggerated claims. "Miss Bennett, isn't it true that you arrived in Bloodstone Valley with no money, no prospects, and a desperate need to survive?" the lawyer asked. "Isn't it possible you saw an opportunity to make yourself important by manufacturing a crisis?" Clara looked at him calmly. "I arrived with $18 and a job offer. What I found was a systematic campaign of terror being waged against innocent families. I didn't manufacture anything. I just wrote down what I witnessed and what people told me they'd experienced. People who might have their own grudges against my client, people who had their homes burned, their livestock killed, and their family members murdered." Clara's voice stayed level. "If documenting those crimes makes me important, then yes, I suppose I'm important, but mostly it just makes me someone who is paying attention." The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they found Hale guilty on 18 counts, including conspiracy, extortion, arson, and accessory to murder. His sentence was 20 years in territorial prison. His associates received varying sentences from 5 to 15 years. Clara felt no satisfaction when the verdict was read, just a tired sort of relief. Justice had been done, but it wouldn't bring back the dead or undo the trauma the valley had endured. After the trial, Ruth pulled Clara aside in the courthouse hallway. "You did good in there. Your aunt would be proud." "My aunt would have found a way to profit from the whole mess," Clara said. "But thank you. What are you going to do now?" The territorial secretary mentioned they might need someone to help oversee the rebuilding fund's distribution. It's a real position, with salary and everything. Clara hadn't considered that possibility. A government position meant stability, regular income, respectability. Everything she'd wanted when she left Boston. "I'll think about it," she said. The ride back to Bloodstone gave her plenty of time to think. A job in the territorial capital meant leaving the valley, leaving the people she'd fought alongside, leaving Ruth and Thomas and the Hayes family, leaving Cole. She realized somewhere around the 3rd day that she didn't want to leave. The valley had scars, but it also had possibility. And for the first time in her life, Clara felt like she belonged somewhere. When they reached Bloodstone, she went straight to Ruth's boarding house and found Cole sitting on the porch. His arm was out of the sling finally, though he still moved carefully. "How was the trial?" he asked. "Guilty on all counts. Hale got 20 years. Clara sat down beside him. "It's over." "Good." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Ruth mentioned the territorial government offered you a job." "They did." Clara watched the sun setting behind the mountains. "I turned it down." Cole looked at her sharply. "Why?" Because I'm needed here more. Clara met his eyes. This valley is going to take years to rebuild properly. Someone needs to make sure the relief funds get distributed fairly, that families get help filing land claims, that the infrastructure gets repaired. Ruth can't do it alone. That's not a real job. There's no salary, no security. I know. Clara smiled slightly. But it's important work, and I've discovered I'm better at important work than I ever was at safe work. Cole studied her face for a long moment. You've changed since you got off that stagecoach. I had to. The person I was wouldn't have survived here. Clara pulled her coat tighter against the evening chill. Turns out I like the person I've become better anyway. She's more useful. She's more than useful. Cole's voice was quiet. She's remarkable. The words hung in the air between them. Clara felt her heart rate pick up, but forced herself to stay still, to not read too much into a simple compliment. I should get inside, she said. Ruth's probably wondering where I am. Clara. Cole caught her hand as she stood. Will you have dinner with me tomorrow? At my ranch. I want to show you something. It wasn't quite a romantic overture, but it was close enough to make Clara's breath catch. What do you want to show me? You'll have to come find out. The corner of his mouth lifted in something almost like a smile. Unless you're afraid of a rancher's cooking. I've survived worse than bad cooking. Clara squeezed his hand once before letting go. Tomorrow then. She walked into the boarding house feeling lighter than she had in months, and found Ruth grinning at her from the kitchen doorway. Don't say it, Clara warned. I'm not saying anything, just noting that Cole Mercer hasn't invited anyone to his ranch in 5 years, but I'm sure it's purely professional. It probably is. And I'm probably going to sprout wings and fly. Ruth laughed at Clara's expression. Go on, get some rest. You'll want to look presentable for your definitely not romantic dinner tomorrow. Clara tried to protest but gave up when Ruth just laughed harder. The next evening, she borrowed one of Ruth's nicer dresses and rode out to Cole's ranch feeling absurdly nervous. The trail was familiar now. She'd ridden it several times coordinating relief efforts, but everything felt different knowing this was personal rather than business. Cole's ranch sat in a valley between two ridges, protected from the worst weather by the surrounding mountains. The main house was log construction, solid and well-maintained. The barn he'd been rebuilding was nearly finished, fresh timber standing out against weathered wood. Cole met her at the door wearing clean clothes and looking almost uncomfortable, which somehow made Clara feel better about her own nervousness. Come in, he said. Dinner's almost ready. The interior of the house surprised her. She'd expected rough frontier bachelor quarters, but the main room was neat and thoughtfully arranged. Books lined one wall. A large fireplace dominated another. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was clean in a way that suggested regular care. This is nice, Clara said, meaning it. It was my wife's doing mostly. I've just tried to maintain what she built. Cole moved to the stove where something was simmering. I hope you like stew. It's about the only thing I cook well. Stew's perfect. Clara sat at the table and watched him work. His movements were economical, practiced. He'd clearly been cooking for himself for years. You said you wanted to show me something? After dinner. Cole ladled stew into bowls and brought them to the table along with bread that was only slightly burned on the bottom. First, tell me about the trial, the parts you didn't mention in your report to the territorial office. So Clara told him about the lawyer's attempts to discredit her, about seeing Hale's expression when the verdict was read, about the conversation with the territorial secretary afterward. Cole listened without interrupting, asking occasional questions. You could have taken that job, he said when she finished. Good salary, important work, chance to make a real difference in territorial policy. I can make a real difference here. Clara broke off a piece of bread. The capital has plenty of qualified people. Bloodstone Valley has Ruth and me and whoever else is willing to help. The math's pretty simple. It's not about math. It's about what you want. Clara set down her bread and looked at him directly. What I want is to stay here, build something that matters, help people who need it. She paused. What do you want, Cole? He was quiet for a long moment, turning his spoon in his stew without eating. I want to stop being angry. I've been angry for 5 years. At the men who killed my family, at myself for not being there to protect them, at the world for being cruel enough to let it happen. And I'm tired of it. He looked up. When I met you, I thought you were just another person who'd get hurt by this valley, someone I'd have to watch suffer or leave or die. But you didn't do any of those things. You fought back, and watching you fight made me remember that anger isn't the only way to survive grief. What's the other way? Clara asked quietly. Building something new. Not to replace what was lost, but to honor it by not giving up. Cole stood and held out his hand. Come on. I want to show you that thing now. Clara took his hand and let him lead her outside. They walked past the barn to a section of land that had been cleared and fenced. In the fading light, Clara could see markers in the ground, stakes with string running between them, outlining the foundation of a building. What is this? She asked. School? Cole gestured at the outlined space. Or it will be once it's built. I've been talking to the other ranchers, and we've agreed to fund construction. Figure we'll need a teacher, books, supplies. But the valley needs educated children if it's going to survive long term. Clara stared at the markers, understanding flooding through her. This is what you've been working on. Partially, I've also been talking to Ruth about expanding the boarding house into a proper community center. And Patterson's planning to rebuild his barn as a shared equipment facility so smaller farms can access tools they can't afford individually. Cole turned to face her. The point is, we're rebuilding better than before, smarter, together, and I want you to be part of that. I'm already part of it, Clara said. No, I mean, Cole took a breath. I'm asking if you'd consider staying permanently, not just helping with relief efforts, but actually settling here. Making this your home. He paused. Making it our home, if you're willing. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Cole, are you asking me to marry you? Eventually, maybe, if you want. He looked almost embarrassed. But right now I'm just asking if you'll stay. Build a life here, see where things go between us without pressure or expectations. He met her eyes. I know it's not what you planned when you left Boston. No rich rancher in Helena, no comfortable house waiting for you. Just a scarred-up cattleman in a valley that almost destroyed itself, offering you hard work and uncertain futures. That sounds perfect, Clara said, and meant it. Cole's expression shifted from nervous to something softer. Yeah. Clara stepped closer. I didn't leave Boston looking for comfort, Cole. I left looking for a place where I mattered, where what I did made a difference. I found that here, and I found you. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough scar tissue under her fingers. So yes, I'll stay. I'll build a life here, and I'll see where things go with you, because I think I already know where they're going, and I'm not afraid of it. Cole kissed her then, careful and tentative at first, then deeper when Clara kissed him back. It wasn't like the romance novels she'd read back east. There was no orchestra swell or poetic declaration. Just two people who'd survived hell together deciding to build something better in its aftermath. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Cole rested his forehead against hers. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. It's been 5 years since I let myself care about anyone. I'm probably going to mess it up. Good thing I'm good at fixing messes, Clara smiled. We'll figure it out together. The next months proved her right. They did figure it out together, though not without stumbling. Clara moved into a small house Ruth helped her buy near the center of town. She continued coordinating relief efforts while also taking on other projects, organizing a lending library, helping establish fair trading agreements between ranchers and merchants, teaching basic literacy to children whose families couldn't afford to send them away for schooling. Cole rebuilt his ranch and started raising horses alongside cattle, having discovered there was demand for good working animals. He visited town more frequently than he had in years, always finding reasons to stop by Clara's house or the boarding house or wherever she happened to be working. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared meals and long conversations and the quiet understanding of people who'd seen each other at their worst and chose to stay anyway. They argued sometimes. Clara thought Cole was too quick to handle problems alone. Cole thought Clara took on too much responsibility for others. But they also learned to compromise and apologize and move forward. 8 months after Hale's conviction, Cole asked Clara to marry him properly. They were sitting on her porch watching the first snow of the season when he pulled out a simple gold band. It was my mother's, he said. Only valuable thing I own besides land. I know it's not fancy, but it's perfect. Clara took the ring and slipped it on. It fit like it had been made for her. Yes, obviously yes. They married in Ruth's boarding house on a cold December afternoon with half the valley in attendance. The ceremony was simple, no fancy decorations or elaborate rituals, just two people making promises in front of witnesses who'd fought beside them. Thomas stood up as Cole's best man, still grinning about how his crazy plan to help Clara rescue Cole had somehow led to this. Ruth cried through the whole thing, though she denied it afterward. Clara wore a dress she'd sewn herself, having finally put her textile skills to use for something personal. Cole wore his best suit and looked terrified until the moment Clara took his hand, at which point he relaxed like he'd finally come home. After the ceremony, there was food and music and dancing in the boarding house parlor. The Morrison family brought venison they'd hunted. Patterson's widow contributed pies made from preserved fruit. The Hayes family provided enough baked goods to feed everyone twice over. Watching the celebration, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. These people weren't just neighbors anymore. They were family, the found kind, built through shared struggle and mutual support, the kind that mattered more than blood. Late in the evening, Ruth pulled Clara aside. "You did good, girl." "With the wedding?" "With everything." Ruth gestured at the crowded room. "A year ago, this valley was dying. People were leaving or getting killed, and the rest of us were too scared to fight back. Now look at us. We're rebuilding, we're organizing, we're protecting each other, and a lot of that is because you refused to give up." "I had help," Clara said. "A lot of help." "True, but you were the spark that started the fire. Don't diminish that." Ruth squeezed her shoulder. "Your aunt raised you to survive by keeping quiet. You taught yourself to survive by speaking up. That's worth celebrating." Clara hugged her, sudden tears burning her eyes. "Thank you for everything, for taking me in when I had nothing, for teaching me how to fight, for being the family I chose." "You're welcome. Now go dance with your husband before someone else claims him." Clara found Cole talking to Jack Hayes about spring planting schedules. She pulled him away over his protests and onto the makeshift dance floor, where other couples were swaying to music from a fiddle player who'd come up from one of the mining camps. "I don't dance," Cole said. "You do now." Clara put his hand on her waist and took the other in hers. "Just follow my lead." They moved clumsily at first, Cole clearly uncomfortable with being watched, but after a few moments he relaxed, and they settled into a rhythm that worked even if it wasn't graceful. "Happy?" Cole asked quietly. Clara thought about the question. A year ago, she'd have equated happiness with security and comfort. Now she understood it was more complicated, built from purpose and connection and the satisfaction of hard work done well. "Very," she said. "You, more than I thought I'd ever be again." Cole pulled her closer. "Thank you for staying, for choosing this life when you could have had something easier." "Easier isn't always better." Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "And this life is mine. I built it. Nobody handed it to me or told me what it should look like. That matters more than easy ever could." The years that followed proved the truth of those words. Life in Bloodstone Valley was never easy. Winters were brutal, summers brought drought, and the work of rebuilding after Hale's destruction took longer than anyone expected. But the valley survived and eventually began to thrive. The school Cole had planned was built the spring after their wedding. Clara taught there 3 days a week, working with children who'd otherwise have no access to education. She discovered she was good at it, better than she'd been at managing her aunt's household, better even than the organizational work she'd done during the crisis. Teaching felt like planting seeds, investing in futures she might not live to see fully realized. Cole's horse breeding operation grew successful enough that he hired help, young men from families who'd lost their ranches and needed work. He taught them not just about horses, but about running an honest business, about standing up for what was right, about taking care of the land that supported them. Together, Clara and Cole transformed the ranch into something more than just a working property. It became a gathering place where neighbors came for advice, where travelers found welcome, where people in trouble knew they'd find help. Clara kept meticulous records of who needed what, connecting surplus with need in ways that kept the valley's economy functioning even when territorial support was slow or insufficient. 3 years after their wedding, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah. The labor was hard and frightening, frontier medicine being what it was, but both mother and daughter survived. Cole held his daughter with shaking hands and tears running down his scarred face. and Clara knew he was thinking about the family he'd lost. "She's not a replacement," Clara said softly. "She's new, different, her own person." "I know." Cole couldn't take his eyes off Sarah's tiny face. "But she's also a second chance, a way forward, and I'll spend every day of my life making sure she grows up safe and loved." He kept that promise. Sarah grew up strong and curious, raised by parents who believed in education, hard work, and standing up for what was right. 2 years later, a son followed, James, who had his father's quiet intensity and his mother's quick mind. Then another daughter, Anna, who was fearless from the moment she could walk. Clara watched her children grow with a mixture of pride and fierce protectiveness. She taught them to read and write, to think critically, to question authority when authority was wrong. Cole taught them to ride and shoot, to respect the land, to judge people by their actions rather than their words. The valley continued to change. The mines reopened under new management with better labor practices after territorial investigators forced reforms. More families moved in, attracted by available land and stories of a community that took care of its own. The town grew beyond its original settlement, adding new businesses and eventually even a telegraph office that connected Bloodstone to the wider world. Through it all, Clara remained involved. She served on the town council, advocated for improved roads and schools, and continued organizing support for families in crisis. She never forgot what it felt like to arrive desperate and alone, never forgot the people who'd helped her survive. That memory drove her to make sure others received the same help. Ruth eventually retired from running the boarding house, turning it over to one of the Morrison daughters while she moved into a small house near Clara's. They remained close, two women who'd survived by refusing to accept defeat. Ruth lived to see her 80s, sharp and sarcastic to the end. The Hayes family prospered. Thomas married a school teacher from Fort Benson and brought her back to the valley. His brothers spread across the territory, starting ranches and businesses of their own, but always maintaining ties to Bloodstone. Jack and Emma lived long enough to see grandchildren fill their rebuilt ranch with noise and life. Victor Hale died in prison 6 years into his sentence. Clara felt nothing when she heard the news. He'd already taken enough from the valley. She refused to give him more space in her thoughts. The trial and its aftermath became part of valley legend, the story changing slightly with each retelling. Some versions made Clara more heroic than she'd actually been. Others emphasized Cole's military background and fighting skills. The truth was more complicated than legend allowed, a collection of desperate people making the best decisions they could with limited options and hoping it would be enough. But Clara didn't mind the embellishment. Stories were how communities remembered what mattered, how they passed values to new generations. If the story of Bloodstone's resistance inspired other people to stand up against injustice, then the details didn't matter as much as the message. On Clara's 40th birthday, Cole surprised her with a gift. He led her to the school she'd helped build and establish and pointed to a new plaque beside the door. Bennett School, it read, founded by Clara Bennett Mercer in recognition of her dedication to education and community service. Clara stared at the plaque, emotions churning too fast to name. "Cole, this is too much." "It's not enough. You've taught over 100 children in this building. You've fought for funding, recruited teachers, made sure every family in this valley had access to education regardless of their ability to pay." Cole put his arm around her shoulders. "The school exists because you insisted it should. Seems fair to put your name on it." "Our name," Clara corrected. "You built this place." "With money and lumber. You built it with vision and determination. There's a difference." Cole kissed her temple. "I'm proud of you, of everything you've become. I thought you should know that." Clara leaned against him, watching their children play in the schoolyard with other valley kids. Sarah was 12 now, already talking about becoming a doctor. James was 10 and wanted to be a surveyor. Anna was 8 and changed her mind about her future daily. "I'm proud of us," Clara said. "Of what we built together. This valley, this family, this life. None of it's what I expected, but all of it's exactly what I needed." That night, lying in bed in the ranch house they had expanded and improved over the years, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the frightened girl who'd stepped off a stagecoach into a blizzard, desperate and alone and certain her life was over. That girl would barely recognize the woman Clara had become. Would probably be shocked by the choices she'd made, the risks she'd taken, the life she'd built from scratch in a place that had tried to destroy her. But Clara wouldn't change any of it. Every hard decision, every moment of fear, every risk that could have ended in disaster, all of it had led her here. To a home that was truly hers, to work that mattered, to a family she'd chosen and been chosen by in return. She'd left Boston looking for safety and found purpose instead. She'd accepted a marriage proposal from a stranger and ended up creating her own future with a man who'd become her partner in every sense. She'd stepped off at the wrong stop and discovered it was exactly where she needed to be. The frontier demanded things from people: strength, courage, adaptability, resilience. It broke those who couldn't meet those demands. But for those who could, it offered something civilization rarely gave: the chance to become who you actually were rather than who you were expected to be. Clara had become someone who fought for justice, who built communities, who raised children to question and challenge, and never accept injustice as inevitable. She'd become someone who mattered not because of who she married or what family she belonged to, but because of what she did and who she helped. And that, she thought as sleep pulled her under, was worth more than any comfortable life in Helena could have been. Bloodstone Valley continued long after Clara's story might have ended in a conventional tale. She lived to see her children grown and starting families of their own. Sarah did become a doctor, studying in the East before returning to serve the valley that had raised her. James became a territorial surveyor, helping establish property boundaries and prevent the kind of fraud Blackthorn had perpetrated. Anna surprised everyone by going into politics, eventually serving in the territorial legislature and fighting for women's property rights. Cole lived into his 70s, still working the ranch he'd built and rebuilt multiple times. He never fully escaped the shadows of his first family's death, but Clara's presence and their children's lives helped him carry the weight. He died peacefully in his sleep, and Clara sat with his body for a long time before telling anyone, saying goodbye to the man who'd taught her that strength wasn't about not being broken, but about building something new from the pieces. Clara herself lived to 82, sharp-minded and still teaching at the school bearing her name until a year before her death. She passed quietly in the house she and Cole had shared, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and a community that had grown from a desperate mining settlement into a thriving town. At her funeral, which drew people from across the territory, Sarah stood and told the story of her mother's arrival in Bloodstone Valley. She told it honestly: the fear, the desperation, the moments when Clara had been more lucky than brave. But she also told about the courage it took to keep going, the intelligence that had documented Hale's crimes, the determination that had ridden through winter mountains to seek justice. "My mother used to say she got off at the wrong stop," Sarah finished. "But I don't think there are wrong stops, just places where we're tested to see who we really are. This valley tested my mother, and she passed. Then she spent the rest of her life making sure others could pass too. That's the legacy she left us. Not just buildings and institutions, but the example of what one person can do when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable." The town that had been Bloodstone Valley eventually grew large enough to incorporate, becoming the town of Bloodstone proper. It developed beyond mining, establishing timber operations, ranching, agriculture, and eventually light manufacturing. The school expanded into a full system with multiple buildings. The territorial government built a courthouse and administrative offices. Telegraph gave way to telephone, and eventually paved roads connected Bloodstone to the wider world. But through all the changes, the community maintained something of the spirit Clara and others had fought for: a commitment to looking after each other, to standing up against corruption, to building something worth preserving. New residents learned the story of the mail-order bride who'd become the valley's savior. And while details shifted with time, the core message remained. Sometimes the right path isn't the safe one. Sometimes the wrong stop is exactly where you need to be. And sometimes the greatest thing you can do is refuse to accept the world as it is and insist on making it better. Clara Bennett had stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but determination and $18 to her name. She'd built a life, saved a community, and raised children who carried her values forward into futures she'd helped make possible. She hadn't planned any of it. She'd just kept moving forward, making the best choices she could, refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.